Buried beneath the cliffs of Newfoundland are seafloors older than bones, older than shells, older than almost every animal shape we recognize. They hold soft impressions of a vanished world fronds in darkness, strange discs, quilted bodies, microbial mats, and the first faint trails of creatures learning to move. The Ediacaran period is not just a chapter before the Cambrian Explosion. It is Earth experimenting with life before life became familiar. Welcome to Calm Earth Science. If this kind of ancient, quiet science helps you relax, please leave a like, subscribe for more deep time documentaries, and share this video with someone who enjoys falling asleep to Earth's oldest mysteries. Thank you for spending your time here. As you settle in, let us know in the comments what time it is where you are and where in the world you are watching or listening from. Now, let us step gently into the ancient history of Earth and enter the Ediacaran Sea. At the close of the Cryogenian, Earth does not return from ice as a simple world restored to an earlier state. It emerges altered, scoured, chemically unsettled, and newly exposed to forces that had been trapped or slowed beneath long intervals of cold. The glaciations before the Ediacaran are among the most severe known from the planet's history, so extensive that some reconstructions describe oceans roofed in ice from high latitudes toward the tropics, while others leave darker strips of open water between frozen margins. The exact reach of the ice remains debated, but the scale of the disruption is not. Glaciers grind against continents, weathering is delayed, then released. Volcanic gases continue to enter the atmosphere while the surface responds sluggishly under white cover. For long stretches, the world seems to have narrowed into endurance, with microbial life persisting in protected places, in slushy seas, in small refuges of chemistry and light, and along the edges where ice never fully seals the planet shut. Then the balance begins to change. Carbon dioxide, supplied by volcanoes and not easily removed by weathering under global ice, accumulates enough to weaken the frozen state. Warming follows. Ice retreats from shorelines and shallow shelves. Rivers return to exposed rock. Meltwater moves across broken landscapes, carrying sediment and dissolved minerals into basins that have been waiting through a planetary winter. The Ediacaran begins in the wake of that thaw, not as a sudden paradise, but as an unstable aftermath in which the planet's surface starts to communicate again with the ocean. That matters because life does not become large in isolation. It depends on chemistry, on energy, on the availability of nutrients, and on the slow construction of environments where cells can afford to cooperate at greater scales. Earlier Earth had already carried life for billions of years. It was not empty. Microbes had shaped sediments, built stromatolites, altered seawater, and changed the air itself through photosynthesis, the process by which light is used to build organic matter while releasing oxygen. Yet for most of that long history, life remained mostly small, microbial, and structurally modest compared with the ecosystems that would later fill the seas. The question at the opening of the Ediacaran is not whether life existed. The question is why, after such a long microbial reign, larger and more complex bodies began to appear. The retreating ice offers one part of the answer, because a melting planet is also a mixing planet. Newly uncovered continents feed rivers with phosphorus, iron, and other materials. Glacial grinding produces fresh mineral surfaces that react quickly with air and water. Sediments pour outward from the land. In coastal waters and open basins, nutrients become more available to microscopic photosynthetic organisms already capable of turning sunlight into chemical energy. Their growth can add oxygen to local waters, and over time to wider parts of the ocean. Oxygen is not merely a background gas in this story. It is a gatekeeper. Larger bodies require ways to move energy through living tissue. Cells that sit deep inside a body cannot rely on the same direct exchange with seawater as a single exposed cell. Diffusion, the passive spreading of molecules from one place to another, becomes limiting as organisms grow thicker and more elaborate. More oxygen in the environment does not automatically produce animals, but it makes certain forms of large life more plausible. It widens the margin in which tissues, surfaces, and internal organization can exist without immediately running into an energy shortage. In that sense, the post-glacial ocean becomes a stage with more room on it, though still a difficult one. The water is not yet the modern ocean. Its chemistry shifts from place to place and through time. Oxygen may be present in some layers while deeper zones remain poorly oxygenated. Nutrient pulses may encourage productivity. Then decay may draw oxygen back down. Carbon, sulfur, iron, and other chemical cycles respond unevenly. This is a world in transition, not a world neatly prepared. The importance of that transition lies in its unevenness. Life often expands through gradients, through boundaries where one condition meets another, where scarcity and supply sit close together. The Ediacaran seas contain those boundaries in abundance. Shallow shelves receive light and nutrients. Deeper basins preserve quiet surfaces. Volcanic ash falls into marine settings. Microbial mats spread across seafloors that are not yet churned constantly by burrowing animals. These mats are not a small detail. They form living carpets of bacteria and other microbes over sediment, binding the surface and giving it a texture unlike much of the later animal-dominated seafloor. Before widespread burrowing, the sediment-water boundary is more stable, more mat-covered, and more capable of recording delicate impressions. It is a seafloor prepared both for life and for fossilization, though not intentionally and not evenly. In this setting, the earliest large Ediacaran organisms do not need to resemble the animals that appear later. Some may have lived attached to the bottom, rising gently into the water column or spreading close to the mat surface. Some may have absorbed dissolved nutrients directly. Some may have had bodies organized around surface area rather than organs, muscles, or mouths. Their forms seem strange partly because the rules of their world are strange. A mat-bound seafloor, low competition, unusual ocean chemistry, and limited animal movement create possibilities that later ecosystems would not preserve for long. This is one of the quiet powers of the Ediacaran. It records not simply the beginning of familiar life, but a period when biology tried arrangements that do not fit easily into later categories. The thaw after the great glaciations does not command these organisms into existence like a single cause producing a single effect. It opens conditions. It alters the availability of oxygen. It increases nutrient delivery. It reshapes basins and shorelines. It creates pulses of productivity and changes the chemistry of the sea. From those changes, larger life becomes possible enough to leave a trace. That trace is still fragile. Soft bodies do not normally fossilize well. A world without shells, bones, or mineral skeletons depends on unusual preservation, on rapid burial, microbial films, chemical reactions, and the happenstance of sediment. The Ediacaran record is therefore both generous and incomplete. It gives sudden windows into lost communities, then closes again. It reveals surfaces crowded with forms, but not always their full thickness, colour, behaviour, or internal structure. Even so, the appearance of large body fossils after the glacial world marks a change in planetary history. The planet has carried life for immense spans before this moment, but now life begins to occupy space differently. It becomes visible at the scale of hands, fronds, discs, quilts, and trails. It begins to influence the seafloor not only through chemistry and microbial binding, but through body shape, height, spacing, reproduction, and eventually movement. The Ediacaran does not erase the microbial earth, it grows out of it. Microbes still dominate many processes. Microbial mats remain central habitats. Photosynthetic cells still feed oxygen into the system. What changes is that the microbial background begins to support larger experiments. This makes the period feel less like a clean beginning than a threshold. One where the old world is still present and the next one has not yet taken control. The cold that came before may have been destructive, but it also reset parts of the planet's surface in ways that made later developments possible. When glaciers withdrew, they left behind altered rocks, disturbed sediments, changing seas, and a renewed flow of nutrients into the ocean. That flow did not guarantee animals. It didn't guarantee ecosystems resembling the modern world. It prepared a set of conditions in which large, soft-bodied organisms could test the limits of shape and survival. The first sections of that story are therefore written not in teeth or shells, but in impressions, mats, ash beds, and chemical hints. The great thaw leaves behind more than water. It leaves a planet with new gradients, new supplies, and new uncertainties. Out of that unsettled aftermath, the Ediacaran world begins to take form, still quiet, still unfamiliar, and still close enough to the microbial past that the boundary between old life and new life remains difficult to draw. Before the Ediacaran can be understood as a world of its own, it has to be placed between two forms of life that are easier to recognize. On one side lies the deep microbial earth, the immense span of time when life is present but mostly small, chemical, and hidden within mats, films, colonies, and single cells. On the other side lies the Cambrian, where the fossil record begins to show animals with bodies that feel more familiar: worms moving through sediment, sponges filtering seawater, arthropods carrying hard parts, predators changing the behavior of prey, and seafloors increasingly shaped by motion. The Ediacaran sits in the interval between these worlds, and that position gives it much of its importance. It is not simply the prelude to the Cambrian, it is the place where the old picture of a sudden animal beginning becomes harder to defend. For a long time, the fossil record seemed to offer a sharp boundary. Below the Cambrian, rocks appeared to hold little more than microbial structures and traces of life too small or too ambiguous to answer the larger question. Above that boundary, recognizable animal diversity seemed to arrive with surprising force. This pattern became known as the Cambrian Explosion, not because life literally appeared in a single instant, but because many animal body plans, behaviors, and hard parts became visible over a geologically short span. The word explosion carries more drama than the rocks themselves require, yet the pattern was real enough to trouble anyone trying to understand evolution as a slow and cumulative process. If complex animals had ancestors, then why did those ancestors seem so difficult to find? If bodies became diverse through descent and modification, then the apparent absence of earlier forms felt less like an answer than a gap in the evidence. Charles Darwin recognized the difficulty in the 19th century. He didn't see it as proof against evolution, but as a warning about the incompleteness of the geological record. Rocks are not a continuous archive. They are eroded, buried, heated, folded, dissolved, and exposed unevenly. Even when organisms live in great numbers, they may leave almost nothing behind if their bodies are soft, if sediment does not cover them quickly, if chemistry does not favour preservation, or if later Earth processes erase the record. The missing ancestors of Cambrian animals might therefore be missing not from life, but from visibility. This distinction matters. The history of life is not the same as the history of fossils. Fossils are a filtered remnant of what lived, shaped by the bodies organisms had, and by the environments in which they died. The Cambrian looks rich partly because skeletons, shells, and mineralized parts begin to enter the story with greater frequency. A shell is not only a biological tool, it is also a gift of future paleontology. Because hard material survives more readily than soft tissue, earlier organisms, if they were soft, thin, or delicate, would have required exceptional circumstances to persist as recognizable marks in stone. The Ediacaran record begins to change that problem by revealing that before the Cambrian seafloor became crowded with familiar animal behaviours, there had already been larger bodies spread across marine settings. They did not look like simple prototypes of trilobites, fish, or modern worms. Many were stranger than that. They appeared as discs, fronds, quilted forms, ribbed ovals, branching structures, and impressions that seem almost designed to resist easy comparison. This is why the Ediacaran is not merely a solution to Darwin's difficulty. It is a deeper complication. It fills part of the gap, but it fills it with organisms that do not always point neatly toward later animals. Some may belong near the base of animal history. Some may represent extinct experiments in multicellular life. Some may be related to known groups only distantly, if at all. Their existence shows that large life was present before the Cambrian, but it also shows that the route toward modern ecosystem was not a straight corridor. It was a landscape of alternatives. To see why that is so disruptive, the microbial world has to be taken seriously on its own terms. For billions of years, microbes were not merely background life. They were the planet's main biological force. They built layered stromatolites in shallow water. They changed the chemistry of oceans and atmosphere. They formed mats that bound sediment and stabilized surfaces. They created local environments where gradients of light, oxygen, sulfur, and organic matter could exist only fractions of a body length apart. A microbial mat may appear simple compared with an animal community, but chemically it can be intricate. It is a living surface, a layered system where different microbes occupy different levels according to available energy and molecules. The Ediacaran organisms enter a world already structured by that microbial labour. They do not appear on a blank seafloor. They appear on surfaces that microbes have built, fed, and held together. That older world gives them ground, nutrients, preservation potential, and perhaps even food. The later Cambrian world, by contrast, becomes increasingly disturbed. Animals burrow into sediment, graze across mats, pump water through their bodies, build skeletons, and interact in ways that make the seafloor more active and less stable. Between the microbial mat ground and the animal-churned sediment lies the Ediacaran transition, a time when large, soft organisms can live on mat-covered surfaces before those surfaces are widely disrupted. This makes the Ediacaran both ancient and oddly temporary. Its communities belong to a window of possibility. They depend on conditions that are neither fully microbial in the old sense, nor fully animal-dominated in the later sense. The fossils from this interval therefore carry a double message. They show the emergence of size, architecture, and ecological spacing before many familiar animal traits become common. But they also show how different large life can be when it grows under different rules. A frond fixed to a dark seafloor does not need to chase prey. A quilted body spread over a microbial mat may interact with its environment in ways that leave no obvious mouth or gut. A disc may be not an entire animal, but the holdfast of a larger form. A surface crowded with repeated shapes may record a community as it lived, not a collection of bodies washed together after death. Each of these possibilities weakens the old assumption that early animal history should be found by searching only for smaller and simpler versions of later animals. The Ediacaran requires a broader imagination, but not an undisciplined one. Its fossils must be interpreted through sediment, chemistry, growth patterns, ecological arrangement, and comparison with living organisms where comparison is useful. The difficulty is that some comparisons seem helpful at first and misleading later. A disc can resemble a jellyfish, until its clustering suggests attachment to the seafloor. A frond can resemble a sea pen, until its growth, environment, and age complicate the resemblance. A ribbed oval can seem alien, until chemical and trace evidence suggest an animal-like mode of life. The period becomes a test of how carefully resemblance should be handled. Similar shape does not always mean close relationship. Different shape does not always mean complete separation. Fossils speak in partial evidence, and Ediacaran fossils speak with unusual softness. The Cambrian Explosion, seen through this older interval, becomes less like a sudden appearance from nothing and more like a transformation in visibility, ecology, and body construction. By the Cambrian, many animals are doing things that leave stronger signatures. They dig deeper, they make more varied traces, they produce hard parts, they prey upon one another, they disturb microbial surfaces that had once helped preserve softer communities. The record grows louder because life itself is changing, and because the kinds of bodies and behaviours being produced are easier for stone to keep. Yet the Ediacaran remains essential because it shows that the silence before the Cambrian was never truly empty. It was selective. It was quiet in the fossil record, not lifeless in the sea. The old gap does not close into a simple story of ancestors waiting in line. Instead, it opens into a broader and more delicate scene, where large organisms appear before familiar animals dominate, where some lineages may lead forward and others vanish sideways, and where the planet experiments with form before skeletons and burrows rewrite the conditions of preservation. That is why the Ediacaran changes the meaning of the Cambrian. It does not remove the importance of the explosion, but it gives it a past. The first familiar animals no longer stand at the edge of an empty darkness. They stand beyond a strange marine world already populated by bodies, surfaces, communities, and failed possibilities. The missing interval is no longer missing in the same way. It has a texture now, and that texture is soft, matte-bound, ash-preserved, and difficult to classify. The deeper question is no longer simply when animals began. It is what kinds of life could exist before animals became the main architects of the seafloor. The first Ediacaran fossils did not enter science as obvious messengers from the dawn of animal life. They appeared instead as doubtful shapes in old rock, too simple in outline to be easily trusted, and too unfamiliar to be placed securely among known organisms. In Newfoundland, along the steep and weathered exposures near St. John's, circular markings were noticed long before the Ediacaran had a formal place in geological time. They were not bones, they were not shells, they were not the ridged armour of trilobites or the coiled chambers of ancient mollusks. They were discs pressed into stone, quiet and repetitive, like impressions left by something soft that had once touched a seafloor and then vanished. Elkanah Billings, a Canadian paleontologist working in the 19th century, recognized that such forms might matter. He described these strange discs from rocks that were far older than the fossiliferous layers most paleontologists expected to study. Yet the interpretation did not settle around them. Their simplicity worked against them. A circle in sediment can be made by many things. It can form through gas escape, soft sediment deformation, mineral growth, or other physical processes that do not require life at all. In a time when the known fossil record seemed to begin in earnest with Cambrian animals, it was easier to treat these markings as geological curiosities than as biological evidence. Their importance was therefore postponed. The rocks held them in plain view, but science had not yet built the right frame around them. This is one of the recurring features of the Ediacaran story. The fossils were not always missing. Often, the categories needed to recognize them were missing. A paleontologist trained to see shells, bones, teeth, leaves, and tracks may hesitate before an impression that looks like a soft disc or a feathered branch without any obvious mouth, gut, limb, or skeleton. The question is not only what the object is, but what kind of life the investigator is prepared to imagine. In the case of the early Newfoundland discs, later named Aspidella, the uncertainty was reasonable. Some examples are isolated and simple. Others occur in clusters that suggest attachment rather than drifting jellyfish. Some are now understood not as entire organisms, but as holdfasts, the anchoring bases of larger frond-like bodies that rose from the seafloor. That interpretation could not be reached from one vague circle alone. It required comparison across many surfaces, better preservation, and a growing awareness that soft-bodied Ediacaran organisms might leave only partial signatures. The fossil may preserve the root, but not the frond. It may preserve the underside, but not the full body. It may record the contact between life and sediment rather than the living form in its complete shape. For decades after those early finds, the evidence remained scattered and easy to dismiss. A few unusual impressions appeared here and there, but without a coherent world around them. They seemed like exceptions rather than the edge of a whole ecosystem. The deeper rocks below the Cambrian still appeared mostly silent, and the Cambrian boundary retained its power as the apparent beginning of abundant animal life. The shift came when fossils were found that were too patterned, too organized, and too unlike ordinary sedimentary structures to be ignored. In England, in Charnwood Forest, a young fossil hunter named Roger Mason discovered a frond-like impression in ancient rock. The form later became known as Charnia masoni. Its body was not a simple smudge. It had a repeated branching structure of a clear axis and a geometric order that strongly suggested a living organism. Yet it came from rocks older than the Cambrian. This mattered because it pushed visible, complex life back into a time where such life had not been expected to exist in recognizable form. Charnia did not solve the Ediacaran at once. It did something more important. It made dismissal harder. A single disc could be questioned as a sedimentary accident. A structured frond, preserved with repeated elements and a coherent architecture, demanded a more biological explanation. From that point, older and scattered finds could be reconsidered. The discs in Newfoundland, the impressions from Australia, the fronds and quilted forms from other regions all began to look less like isolated puzzles and more like pieces of a broad Precambrian biota. The name Ediacaran itself draws from the Ediacara Hills of South Australia, where a remarkable suite of soft-bodied fossils brought further weight to the recognition that a distinctive world had existed before the Cambrian. These Australian fossils included forms that looked ribbed, quilted, circular, leaf-like, or segmented in unfamiliar ways. Some seemed to lie flat against the seafloor. Others seemed to have possessed raised bodies with repeated units. They were not easy to classify, but their abundance and diversity made one point difficult to avoid. The late Precambrian seas had not been empty of large life. They had hosted communities whose bodies were preserved not through skeletons, but through impressions and moulds, through the delicate partnership of sediment, microbial mats, and burial. The difficulty was that recognition did not lead immediately to understanding. Early interpretations leaned toward familiar modern comparisons, because that is how unknown fossils are often first approached. A disc might be called a jellyfish, a frond might be called a sea pen, a ribbed oval might be compared with a worm or an arthropod. These comparisons were not foolish. They were attempts to make the unfamiliar legible, but the Ediacaran fossils kept resisting them. If Aspidella were jellyfish stranded on the bottom, their clustered arrangements and attachment-like patterns were difficult to explain. If Charnia were a sea pen, its age, growth structure, and deep water setting caused problems. If every strange form were forced into a modern group, the result became less a solution than a collection of uneasy resemblances. The fossils seemed biological, but not comfortably modern. That tension became part of their power. They showed that paleontology could not understand the earliest large life merely by shrinking modern animals and moving them backward in time. The Ediacaran required attention to modes of preservation, to community structure, and to body plans no longer represented in the same form today. A fossil impression from this period might not contain the parts most useful for classification. There may be no mouth to inspect, no limb joint, no mineral shell, no head, no tail, no clear organ system. Instead, the evidence may lie in repeated modules, branching angles, surface relief, growth series, or the way many specimens share a bedding plane. This made the field unusually dependent on patience. Each new surface could change the interpretation of a familiar form. A disc that once seemed complete could become the base of a larger organism. A frond that once seemed like a plant could be placed in dark water, where photosynthesis was impossible. A quilted shape that once looked like nothing living could begin to suggest an extinct architecture built around exchange with seawater. As more localities were found, the Ediacaran stopped being a single odd occurrence and became a global problem. Fossils appeared on multiple continents, in rocks of different ages and environments. Canada became especially important, not only because of the early Newfoundland discoveries, but because later sites such as Mistaken Point preserved entire seafloor communities with extraordinary detail. Australia, Russia, Namibia, and other regions added their own assemblages. The repeated appearance of strange soft-bodied forms across the world made it clear that this was not a local accident. It was a chapter in the history of life. Still, the chapter was written in a script that didn't match later fossil records. Instead of hard parts accumulating as durable remains, the Ediacaran often offered surfaces. Bedding planes became pages. Organisms appeared as raised or sunken relief, as if the ancient sea had pressed them into a thin boundary between mud and ash. To read these pages, paleontologists had to think like sedimentologists, ecologists, and taphonomists at once. Taphonomy, the study of how organisms become fossils, became especially important because the process of preservation shaped what could be seen. The fossil was never just the organism. It was the organism after burial, decay, compression, mineral reaction, and exposure. That is why the first impressions in stone were both evidence and warning. They revealed large life before the Cambrian, but they also showed how easily such life could be misread. Their bodies were soft enough to vanish under ordinary conditions, strange enough to resist quick identification, and ancient enough to disturb an already fragile timeline. The early history of their discovery is therefore not only a story about fossils being found, it is a story about perception changing slowly enough to meet them. Once the right frame formed, the old discs and fronds no longer looked like errors at the edge of the record. They became openings into an ocean where unfamiliar organisms grew on mat-covered bottoms, lived without obvious skeletons, and left their presence as texture rather than bone. The Ediacaran had been waiting in the rock as a set of faint signatures. What changed was the willingness to believe that a simple impression could carry the memory of an entire lost world. Mistaken Point does not preserve the Ediacaran as scattered souvenirs from a disturbed shoreline. It preserves ancient seafloors as broad, tilted plains, surfaces that once lay under deep marine water and later rose into coastal cliffs on the Avalon Peninsula of Newfoundland. The rock has been lifted, folded, exposed, and cut by the North Atlantic, but the bedding planes still carry the arrangement of organisms that lived there before burial. This is what makes the locality so important. It is not simply that fossils occur there. It is that entire surfaces appear to record communities in place, with many individuals lying where they grew, crowded across the sediment like a soft forest that never reached sunlight. The setting is crucial, because these organisms were not living in a bright, shallow lagoon where plant-like explanations could easily survive. Geological work on the surrounding sediments indicates deposition in deep water, beyond the reach of ordinary photosynthesis. Light does not penetrate very far into the ocean, and the deepest Ediacaran communities at Mistaken Point were living well below the sunlit zone. That single fact changes how their bodies must be understood. A frond shape does not make them plants. Branching does not require leaves. Height above the seafloor does not imply a search for light. Their world was dark, cold compared with shallow tropical water, and quiet enough for fine sediment and volcanic ash to settle over delicate bodies without tearing them apart. The ash is the second key to the place. During the Ediacaran, volcanic eruptions sent fine material through the water column, and some of that ash fell across living sea floors. When it landed, it sealed communities under a thin mineral blanket. The comparison often made is to Pompeii, but the Ediacaran version is slower, colder, and marine. There are no buildings, no sudden human gestures, no ash-filled streets. There is only a deep seafloor, a mat-bound surface, and soft organisms fixed in place as sediment closes over them. Yet the comparison works in one important way. Burial comes before the community can be widely rearranged. Organisms are not transported long distances and sorted by waves. They are not gathered into a storm deposit. They are captured as an ecological surface. That is why the spacing, sizes, and orientations of the fossils matter. They are not merely anatomical clues, they are community clues. A bedding plane can show whether forms grew close together, whether some types dominated early surfaces, whether taller bodies were rarer than shorter ones, and whether the seafloor supported a mature mixture of organisms or a simpler colonizing stage. The preservation itself depends on a delicate sequence. The organisms are soft. They have no mineral skeleton. Under normal conditions, their tissues would decay, collapse, or be erased by later disturbance. But at Mistaken Point, microbial mats likely helped stabilize the sediment surface, while the ash provided rapid cover and a fine-grained mold. The result is a record of impressions, not bodies in the ordinary sense. What remains is relief on stone-raised ridges, branching modules, spindle-like outlines, feathered forms, hold-fast discs, and traces of bodies that were once three-dimensional but are now pressed into a narrow language of surface texture. The fossils often look like drawings, but they are not drawings. They are the physical memory of contact, burial, decay, and mineral replacement. To read them requires attention to the rock as much as to the organism. A raised structure on one surface may represent the underside of a body. A sunken form may represent where sediment filled space left by decayed tissue. Fine ash can preserve small details, while coarser sediment may blur them. The fossil is never just what lived. It is what lived, how it died, how it was covered, and how the rock later split open. This is especially important at Mistaken Point because many of the forms belong to rangeomorphs, organisms whose repeated branching architecture does not match familiar animals, algae, or fungi in any easy way. They appear as fronds, spindles, comb-like bodies, bushy forms, and other arrangements built from repeated units. On the bedding planes, they can be densely packed, with some surfaces showing a wide mixture of morphologies and others dominated by one form. Such patterns are difficult to interpret from isolated specimens, but a whole sea floor allows the ecology to come forward. Some surfaces look like early communities where a single kind of organism spread quickly over available space. Others suggest a more developed assemblage with several forms occupying the same environment. This makes Mistaken Point more than a fossil site. It is a preserved ecosystem. But an ecosystem unlike a modern reef, kelp forest, or muddy shelf. There are no obvious fish, no burrowing crabs, no shelled mollusks moving across the bottom. There is very little evidence for active disturbance by large animals in the oldest of these communities. Instead, the scene is dominated by organisms attached to the sediment, arranged across microbial mats, depending on the water around them for whatever energy and nutrients their bodies could obtain. The stillness should not be mistaken for simplicity. A dark seafloor can be ecologically complex even without rapid movement. Water flow matters, height matters, surface area matters, the distance between individuals matters, the chemistry of dissolved organic material matters, the mat beneath them matters. Every body shape records a possible solution to living in that quiet water. Some forms rise upward, increasing contact with passing seawater. Others spread or branch in ways that may have maximized exchange across their surfaces. The absence of mouths and guts in the fossils does not make them lifeless or primitive in a careless sense. It suggests that their way of living may have been organized around a different set of biological constraints. Mistaken Point helps make that possibility visible because the organisms are preserved where those constraints operated. In shallow water, a branching body might be mistaken for something light harvesting. In deep water, that explanation fails. In a transported deposit, crowding might be an accident. On an in-place seafloor, crowding becomes ecological information. In a single specimen, a disc might seem like a complete organism. In association with fronds and repeated holdfasts, it may become an anchor. The locality keeps forcing interpretation away from easy resemblance and toward the conditions of life. The deep setting also changes the emotional shape of the Ediacaran story. These were not creatures waiting in the shallows for the Cambrian to arrive. Some of the earliest large communities lived far below the surface, in darkness, attached to sediments that had not yet been heavily churned by animals. Their world was removed from waves, storms, and daylight, but not from change. Ash fell from eruptions. Fine sediment drifted in. Currents passed over the mat. Dissolved nutrients moved through the water. Bodies grew, competed for space, reproduced, and disappeared. The fossil surfaces preserve only moments from that longer rhythm, but the moments are unusually complete. They show that before skeletonized animals became common, large life had already built communities with structure and spacing. That structure can be studied almost like a landscape. Paleontologists can map specimens across a surface, measure their lengths and orientations, compare the abundance of forms, and ask whether the distribution reflects growth, reproduction, current direction, or ecological succession. A single bedding plane becomes a field site from more than 500 million years ago. The field is not walked through in mud, but across stone. Each fossil is both an individual and a coordinate in a community pattern. The value of such preservation is matched by its limits. The ash captures surfaces, not full lifetimes. It records external form better than internal anatomy. It preserves some communities, not others. It favours organisms that lived in the right place at the right moment beneath the right kind of sediment. There must have been Ediacaran worlds that left no comparable record, bodies that decayed without trace, communities that were never sealed, and environments where preservation failed before the first stage of fossilization could begin. Mistaken Point is therefore not the whole Ediacaran. It is one of its clearest windows. Its clarity can be misleading if treated as complete, but indispensable if understood as a rare view into deep water life. What it reveals is a seafloor where soft organisms could become abundant without familiar animal architecture, where volcanic ash could turn ecological arrangement into stone, and where darkness did not prevent large bodies from forming. The ancient plains of Newfoundland hold the Ediacaran at the level of community rather than rumour. They show that the period was not only a scattered collection of odd fossils, but a living world with surfaces, populations, and repeated biological designs. Yet the same preservation that makes the view so vivid also narrows it. The ash gives shape, but not everything. It fixes a moment, but not the full organism. It makes the seafloor visible, while leaving the inner life of its inhabitants mostly closed. The next question therefore rises from the rock itself. What kind of body could live so widely in darkness, leave such delicate geometry behind, and still refuse the familiar names of animal, plant, or fungus? The rangeomorph body begins with a problem of recognition. It is organized enough to be biological, repeated enough to imply growth rules, and strange enough to resist comfortable comparison. On the bedding plains of mistaken point, rangeomorphs appear as fronds, spindles, combs, bush-like forms, and branching impressions that seem at first to borrow pieces from several living groups, without belonging cleanly to any of them. Some rise from a holdfast disc like a feathered structure standing in the water. Some lie as long, tapered shapes divided by repeated elements. Some branch outward in a way that suggests a living geometry more than a body built from organs. Their importance lies not only in their age, but in their architecture. They show that early large life did not have to begin by assembling the familiar parts of later animals. It could become large through repetition, surface, and modular construction. A rangeomorph is often described as fractal, but the word needs to be handled gently. In strict mathematics, a fractal repeats its pattern exactly at every scale, endlessly. Living tissue cannot do that without limit. What rangeomorphs show is self-similar branching, where a large branch is made from smaller branches that resemble the whole, and those smaller branches may be built from still smaller units. The same design logic seems to echo through the body, not perfectly, but clearly enough to matter. This makes them look unlike organisms built around a head, a gut, limbs, muscles, or a central skeleton. Their bodies seem to be composed of modules, and the modules themselves repeat the basic pattern of the organism. The result is a form that can expand without becoming anatomically complicated in the usual animal sense. It can add surface and size by repeating a growth unit, much as a fern repeats leaflets or a coral colony repeats polyps, though neither comparison captures the full difference. Rangeomorphs are not simply plants without sunlight, nor corals before reefs, nor fungi spread into the sea. They are a distinctive solution to the Ediacaran environment. That solution begins with surface area. For any organism that exchanges material directly with seawater, the amount of exposed surface matters, dissolved nutrients, gases, and waste products must cross the boundary between body and water. A simple lump becomes inefficient as it grows, because its volume increases faster than its exposed exterior. Cells inside the body become farther from the surrounding water. Without a circulatory system, a gut, or internal channels that can move material efficiently, large size becomes dangerous. The rangeomorph design may have avoided part of that problem by folding and branching the body into many repeated surfaces. Instead of becoming a thick mass, it became an expanded interface. More water could pass close to more living tissue. More of the body could remain near the outside. In a dark, deep water setting, where photosynthesis was unavailable, this was not a strategy for gathering light. It was likely a strategy for living in chemical contact with the ocean. This is why their shapes are so revealing. A frond form is not merely decorative. A spindle is not merely odd. A comb-like rangeomorph is not a failed version of a later animal. Each body plan may represent a different way of placing repeated surfaces into moving seawater. Height above the mat could lift tissue into currents that carried dissolved organic material. Branching could increase contact without requiring heavy internal organs. Narrow modules could keep diffusion distances short. The organism could be large to the eye while remaining thin and exposed at the level where exchange occurred. Its shape may have been its physiology. In later animals, the body often hides its essential work inside: digestion, circulation, respiration, coordination in a rangemorph. Much of that work may have been pushed outward into the arrangement of the surface itself. The fossil record makes this difficult to prove because internal anatomy is almost never preserved. No stomachs are visible, no mouths are obvious, no limbs or sensory organs announce themselves. The absence of such structures does not mean the organisms were simple in every way, but it does mean that their complexity was expressed differently from the complexity of later animals. Their sophistication lies in pattern, scale, and exchange. This difference explains why early interpretations struggled. When an ancient form has no clear modern counterpart, the mind tries to anchor it to something familiar. A frond resembles a sea pen, a branching form resembles a plant, a repeated structure resembles a colonial animal, but each resemblance breaks under pressure. Sea pens are crustacean animals with a different internal organization and a later evolutionary context. Plants require light that the deep mistaken point seafloor did not receive. Colonial animals repeat individuals, while rangemorph modules do not necessarily behave like separate animals within a colony. Rangemorphs sit near the edge of classification because they force the question of what counts as animal-like before animals become fully recognizable. Some researchers have considered whether they belong within early animals. Others have treated them as an extinct experiment in multicellular organization. The safest description is also the most revealing. They are Ediacaran organisms with a body plan not known from living life in the same form. Their architecture may have been successful for its time precisely because the Ediacaran seafloor permitted it. Microbial mats held the sediment steady. Large mobile grazers and deep burrowers were not yet transforming every surface. Predators capable of tearing soft. Fixed bodies may have been rare or absent in many of these communities. The ocean contained dissolved organic carbon, and the chemistry of the water may have allowed passive absorption to supply at least part of their needs. In such a world, a body optimized for surface contact could thrive without the equipment that later animals would require in more competitive settings. Rangemorphs therefore represent not a primitive failure in a simple ladder toward modernity, but a local optimum, a way of being well suited to a world that no longer exists. Their growth patterns strengthen this impression. Some forms seem to increase in size by inflation, with smaller and larger specimens showing similar numbers of modules, as though the same parts expanded as the organism grew. Others appear to add modules, extending the body by repeating new units at the growing edge. Both strategies suggest a developmental system controlled by rules of repetition rather than by the assembly of specialized organs. Repetition is one of life's most powerful tools. It can build leaves, feathers, branching blood vessels, fungal networks, coral colonies, and many other structures. In the Ediacaran, repetition may have allowed rangemorphs to reach sizes that single cells or simple microbial films could not, while avoiding the internal demands faced by thicker animal bodies. A module could be copied, expanded, angled, and arranged, producing a surprising variety of forms from a shared architectural principle. This helps explain why the rangemorphs at Mistaken Point can appear both related and diverse. The same self-similar logic underlies many shapes, but the shapes occupy space differently. A tall frond interacts with currents in one way. A low reclining form does so in another. A spindle distributes its modules along a central body. A bush-like form may create a more compact field of surfaces. Diversity arises not by abandoning the design, but by exploring its possibilities. The Ediacaran world, seen through rangemorphs, becomes a quiet laboratory of body architecture. Variation appears, some forms survive and reproduce, and environmental conditions sort among them. The result feels exploratory from a distance, because so many later biological assumptions are absent. There is no obvious front end leading the body through sediment. There is no sign of chasing or escaping. There is no hard shell, no chewing apparatus, no mineralized defense. The organism's commitment is to being placed, anchored, exposed, branched, and open to the water. Even the holdfasts reinforce this picture. The discs at the base of some fronds are essential clues. They show attachment to the seafloor, and they help transform isolated circular impressions into parts of larger organisms. A rangemorph did not simply drift down like a jellyfish and settle after death. Many grew fixed to a surface, holding position while the water moved around them. That fixed life gives the body plan its context, a soft organism that cannot run, bite, or burrow must succeed by its relation to flow, chemistry, and available space. It must occupy the seafloor in a way that allows growth without inviting immediate collapse. The rangemorph answer was elegant in an alien way. Build a body from repeated branches, keep tissue close to seawater, and let geometry do some of the work that organs later performed. It has no face, no motion that fossil surfaces can clearly show, no dramatic evidence of behavior. Its life is preserved as arrangement. Yet that arrangement marks a major step in the history of size. Before animals became active engineers of the seafloor, rangemorphs show that large multicellular bodies could already organize ecosystems in deep water. They reveal that the path from microbes to animals included forms whose success was real, widespread, and temporary. Their disappearance later should not erase that success. For millions of years, these patterned bodies stood or lay across Ediacaran mats, turning the boundary between organism and ocean into a complex surface of exchange. The question they leave behind is not merely what group they belong to, it is whether the categories built from living organisms are wide enough to hold a world in which anatomy could be mostly geometry, and survival could depend on the quiet expansion of a surface into dark water. The feeding problem begins with an absence. In many Ediacaran fossils, the body is large enough to imply a steady demand for energy. Yet the preserved surface offers no obvious mouth, no gut, no biting edge, no filtering chamber, and no clear opening where food passed in and waste passed out. Later animals often announce their way of life through anatomy. A clam has structures for drawing water across gills. A worm leaves a trail of motion through sediment. A predator carries grasping parts, eyes, teeth, claws, or some other evidence of pursuit and capture. The rangemorphs and many of their deep-water companions do not offer that kind of signal. They seem to have lived fixed to the seafloor, anchored to microbial mat grounds, lifting or spreading soft modular bodies into the water, and yet they became abundant enough to cover entire bedding plains. The question is not whether they needed nourishment. All living bodies do. The question is how a body without visible feeding organs could maintain itself in a dark ocean. At first, the most familiar answer was suspension feeding, the straining of small particles from seawater. Modern seas contain many animals that live this way. Sponges pump water through porous bodies. Sea pens and corals use tentacles to capture suspended food. Feather stars spread arms into passing currents. In a deep, quiet environment where the water carries organic particles, a stationary body can survive by letting the ocean bring food past it. The tearing patterns at Mistaken Point make this idea tempting. When fossil surfaces are measured, organisms appear to have occupied different heights above the seafloor. In a forest, the tallest plants often form the densest canopy because light comes from above and height is rewarded. In some Ediacaran communities, the opposite pattern seems more plausible. The tallest forms are not necessarily the most crowded, and shorter forms can be more numerous close to the mat. That arrangement has been compared with suspension feeding communities, where organisms occupy different levels in the water column to reduce interference and make use of flow. Height would then matter because it changes access to passing material. A taller body reaches a different current. A lower body samples a different layer near the bottom. The community becomes a vertical arrangement of feeding surfaces rather than a competition for light. Yet suspension feeding also creates difficulties. Animals that capture particles usually need structures that hold, sort, digest, or move food. Tentacles, pores, ciliated surfaces, internal cavities, or digestive tissues often leave at least some anatomical expectation, even if the fossil record is incomplete. The best preserved rangemorphs do not clearly show these features. Their branching surfaces appear elaborate, but not obviously equipped for grasping particles or moving them inward. This does not entirely rule out feeding on suspended matter, because soft tissues can decay and fine structures can vanish before preservation. Still, the absence is persistent enough to push interpretation in another direction. For many rangemorphs, the leading hypothesis has become osmotrophy, the uptake of dissolved organic carbon directly across the body surface. The word sounds technical, but the idea is simple. Instead of swallowing pieces of food, an organism absorbs useful molecules dissolved in the water around it. Many microbes live partly by this kind of direct exchange. For a large multicellular organism, osmotrophy becomes more difficult, because every living part needs access to the surrounding fluid. That is where the rangemorph form becomes important again. A branching, self-similar body creates a great deal of exposed surface while keeping much of the living tissue close to seawater. The more finely divided the body, the more boundary it creates between organism and ocean. If the Ediacaran Ocean contained enough dissolved organic material, and if water moves steadily across these surfaces, then a mouthless body might not need to gather food in the animal sense. Its entire surface could function as a feeding interface. In that interpretation, the strange beauty of the rangemorph is not decoration, it is necessity. The organism turns itself outward because its nourishment depends on contact. This also helps explain why the deep water setting is not a disadvantage in the same way it would be for a plant. A plant-like body in darkness would fail because there is no light to power photosynthesis. An osmotrophic body does not need sunlight directly. It needs dissolved compounds produced elsewhere or generated within the broader ocean system, carried by currents into contact with its tissues. The Ediacaran Ocean after the Great Glaciations may have been unusually suited to this strategy in some places. Nutrient delivery from continents, microbial productivity in sunlit waters, and incomplete ecological competition could have allowed dissolved organic carbon to accumulate in ways less common in later, more animal-dominated seas. This remains a cautious reconstruction, not a settled portrait, but it connects the body plan to the environment with unusual force. It explains why surface area matters so much. It explains why internal organs are hard to find. It explains why stationary organisms could be widespread on deep sea floors. The same explanation also sets limits. Osmotrophy works best when bodies are thin, folded, branched, or otherwise arranged so that diffusion distances remain short. If an organism becomes too thick, cells inside are cut off from the dissolved supply. If water flow is too weak, the surface becomes surrounded by depleted fluid. If dissolved organic material falls too low, the body cannot meet its needs. Rangemorphs, in this view, are not primitive because they lack mouths. They are specialized for a narrow ecological opportunity. Their bodies are tuned to a world where direct exchange with seawater may have been enough, at least for a time. The fragility of that opportunity is part of the story. As later animals spread, as seafloors became more disturbed, as burrowing increased and food webs changed, an osmotrophic way of life at large size may have become harder to sustain. The body that once solved the Ediacaran problem may have become poorly suited to the Cambrian one. Other Ediacaran organisms complicate the picture further. Not every form was a rangeomorph, and not every Ediacaran organism was immobile or mouthless in the same way. Dickinsonia, for example, has been interpreted through several lines of evidence as an animal or animal-like organism that may have fed by moving over microbial mats and absorbing or digesting material beneath it. Kimberella may have scraped mats with a feeding structure, leaving scratch-like traces near its body fossils. Cludina carried a more rigid tubular skeleton and may have lived in ways closer to later benthic animals. These examples show that the Ediacaran was not a single feeding experiment. It was an ecosystem with different strategies emerging side by side. Some organisms seem to have depended on dissolved nutrients. Some grazed on mats. Some may have filtered particles. Some may have occupied reef-like structures. Some may already have been involved in early predator-prey relationships. The rangeomorphs are central because they show the most unfamiliar solution, but they do not define the whole period. The feeding question, therefore, becomes a way of separating worlds within the Ediacaran itself. In the oldest deep-water communities, life often appears fixed, surface-rich, and quiet. In later and shallower assemblages, more movement and more animal-like feeding appear. This does not mean one simple line of progress runs through the entire period. Environment, preservation, and evolution are tangled together, but feeding is one of the places where the tangle begins to show its shape. A body that absorbs dissolved organic carbon needs a stable exposed surface. A grazer needs a mat to exploit and some way to move over it. A burrower needs sediment that can be entered and a behavioral program for searching. A predator needs prey and a means of attack. Each feeding mode alters the seafloor differently. Each creates new pressures for other organisms. Once feeding becomes active, the old stability of the mat ground begins to weaken. Before that transformation is complete, the rangeomorphs occupy a quieter possibility. One in which eating is not a visible act but a constant exchange across a living surface. Their silence in the fossil record is therefore misleading. They may not have bitten, chased, or swallowed, but they were still participating in the movement of carbon through the sea. They turned dissolved matter into tissue. They grew upward from holdfasts. They reproduced across surfaces. They formed tiered communities in darkness. What seems passive at first becomes, on closer inspection, a different kind of biological work. The Ediacaran seafloor was not waiting for mouths to become alive with feeding. It was already feeding through surfaces, mats, currents, and chemical gradients. The later animal world would make nourishment more visible, more forceful, and more behaviorally complex. But at Mistaken Point and places like it, the earliest large organisms show another route, softer and more exposed, where the boundary between body and ocean may have been the main organ of survival. A microbial mat is easy to underestimate because it lies flat. It does not rise like a forest, flash like a reef, or move like an animal crossing sediment. Yet on the Ediacaran seafloor, the mat was one of the main structures of the living world. A thin layered fabric of bacteria and other microbes binding mud, trapping grains, shaping chemistry, and turning loose sediment into a more stable surface. The large organisms preserved at places such as Mistaken Point did not live above an ordinary modern bottom. They lived on a mat ground, a seafloor whose skin was alive. This matters because the mat was not merely a background beneath the fossils. It helped create the conditions in which they could attach, feed, spread, and later be preserved. In a modern shallow marine setting, many sediments are constantly disturbed by worms, crustaceans, mollusks, and other animals. They burrow, mix, graze, ventilate, and overturn the upper layers. The surface becomes a zone of motion. In much of the Ediacaran, before deep and widespread bioturbation became common, large areas of seafloor could remain comparatively sealed by microbial growth. The result was a different kind of habitat, one where soft bodies could rest on or anchor into a coherent surface without being immediately disrupted by animals tunneling beneath them. The mat could hold impressions. It could resist erosion. It could create a boundary that was both physical and chemical, firm enough to be used and delicate enough to record contact. For the organisms attached to it, that boundary may have been as important as soil is to rooted plants, though the comparison must remain limited. A rangeomorph holdfast did not root into soil for light-driven growth. It attached to a living sediment surface in dark water, depending on the water column and the mat-shaped world around it. The surfaces at mistaken points show how this habitat could become crowded. Some bedding planes contain many forms together, while others are dominated by one shape, such as dense spreads of spindle-like organisms. These differences are not random decoration. They hint at ecological succession, the gradual change of a community as organisms arrive, grow, and make room or fail to make room for others. A surface dominated by one form may represent an early stage, a newly available seafloor colonized quickly by organisms well suited to spread across open mat. In the reference material, Fractophusis is treated in this way as a likely early colonizer, something like the first plants appearing after a disturbance on land, though here the disturbance is marine and Precambrian, when nearly all visible individuals on a surface belong to one form. The community appears immature, not in the sense of weakness, but in the sense that ecological variety has not yet accumulated. More diverse surfaces suggest a later or more developed stage, where several body plans share space, tier themselves above the mat, and occupy the seafloor in different ways. This kind of reading turns fossil bedding planes into more than collections of shapes. They become community records. The distance between fossils begins to matter. Their sizes matter. Their density matters. The absence of some forms matters almost as much as their presence. If organisms were transported after death, these patterns would be harder to trust. But when ash burial freezes communities close to where they lived, spatial arrangement becomes evidence. A crowded patch may reveal reproductive spread. A gap may mark a place where attachment failed, where current conditions differed, or where preservation later broke down. A cluster of similar individuals may suggest colonization from a nearby parent, or a surface that offered a particularly suitable patch of mat. Paleontology becomes a study of distribution as much as anatomy. This is especially valuable in the Ediacaran because many organisms give so little direct evidence of internal life. When mouths, organs, and limbs are absent, ecology has to be read from position, repetition, and association. The microbial mat helps make that possible by providing a surface stable enough for such associations to survive. It also carried food. For mobile Ediacaran animals or animal-like organisms, the mat itself may have been a grazing ground. Dickinsonia appears in some places with repeated resting or feeding traces, as if it moved across the seafloor and processed the microbial layer beneath it. Kimberella may have scratched at mats, leaving marks that suggest a more active feeding style. Tiny tracemakers later tunneled through the uppermost levels of mat-bound sediment, feeding in shallow paths. These animals belong most strongly to later parts of the Ediacaran story, but their presence reveals a major ecological tension. The same microbial fabric that supported and preserved the older mat-ground communities also became a resource to be eaten. Once animals began using mats as food, the seafloor changed from a stable platform into a contested surface. At first, the disturbance was small. Trails were shallow. Grazing paths were simple. The mats could continue to grow, and attached organisms could still occupy patches of seafloor. But even minor movement introduced a new relationship between body and environment. A fixed ranger morph lived by remaining in place, while a grazer lived by crossing the surface and consuming what had formed there. The mat held both possibilities, and the tension between them would become increasingly important as the period approached the Cambrian. The chemistry inside a microbial mat also shaped the habitat. Mats are layered because microbes at different depths perform different tasks. Near the surface, photosynthetic microbes may use light in shallower settings. Below them, other microbes may live with less oxygen, using sulfur compounds, organic matter, or other chemical pathways. Even in deep water, where light is absent, microbial communities can still organize around available nutrients and chemical gradients. This means the seafloor was not a simple sheet of slime. It was a structured living boundary, with small differences in chemistry across very short distances, for soft-bodied Ediacaran organisms resting on it. Those gradients may have influenced attachment, decay, mineralization, and the chances of preservation. A mat can slow the movement of oxygen into sediment, trap organic matter, and create conditions favorable to early mineral films. During burial, those conditions may help stabilize the impression of a soft body long enough for sediment and minerals to capture its outline. Without mats, many Ediacaran fossils might not exist in recognizable form. The mat was therefore both habitat and archive. It supported life, then helped write life into stone. This double role is one reason the Ediacaran record can look so different from later fossil records. A shell can preserve itself through its hardness. A soft Ediacaran body needed the surrounding environment to collaborate. The microbial mat was part of that collaboration, holding the seafloor steady beneath volcanic ash or sediment, and allowing delicate relief to persist. Yet this also means the record is biased toward mat-associated organisms and settings. The creatures known best are those that lived where mats, burial, and chemistry allowed impressions to form. Other Ediacaran organisms may have lived in places where the mat was thin, where sediment was too mobile, where oxygen conditions differed, or where burial came too late. Their absence from the fossil record may reflect the failure of preservation rather than the absence of life. Every fossil surface is therefore both a window and a filter. It shows a real community, but only the kind of community that could be captured. The mat-bound world also changes how maturity and diversity should be imagined. A mature Ediacaran community was not necessarily full of predators, fast movers, or hard skeletons. It could be mature through spacing, height, reproductive spread, and the coexistence of different soft forms on the same living substrate. The richness was quiet. It lay in how organisms partitioned flow, occupied patches, and grew from the seafloor without uprooting one another. Competition may have existed, but it did not need claws or jaws to be real. A taller frond could alter currents for smaller neighbours. A dense field of early colonizers could limit where later forms attached. A mat surface already occupied by holdfasts could become less available to new arrivals. Ecological pressure can be soft and still effective. Over time, such pressures may have shaped the distribution of forms across the seafloor, favouring those that attached well, exchanged efficiently with seawater, reproduced successfully, or tolerated the chemical conditions close to the mat. This gives the Ediacaran world an unexpectedly textured ecology. It is not a simple waiting room before animals take over. It is a place where microbial engineering and large soft-bodied life meet, each depending on the other in ways that later ecosystems would disrupt. The microbial mats made stable surfaces possible. The large organisms transformed those surfaces into visible communities. The first mobile animals then began to feed upon and disturb the same fabric, slowly weakening the conditions that had supported the older world. The seafloor as living fabric was therefore not permanent. It was a temporary architecture, durable enough to hold communities for millions of years, fragile enough to be undone by the very animal innovations that followed. In the impressions left behind, the mat can no longer be separated from the organisms it carried. It is beneath their holdfasts, around their bodies, inside their preservation, and at the centre of the ecological shift that would eventually make their world harder to sustain. Growth and reproduction are rarely preserved as events. In the Ediacaran, they have to be reconstructed from stillness, from the sizes of bodies sealed on bedding planes, from the spacing between individuals, and from repeated shapes arranged across surfaces that were once living sea floors. No fossil at Mistaken Point records a ranger morph in the act of dividing, releasing young or extending a living runner across the mat. What remains are patterns after the fact. A large individual sits among smaller ones. A surface carries many specimens of the same form, some tiny, some broad, some placed with a regularity that seems unlikely to be accidental. A frond preserves the same basic architecture at different sizes. A spindle-like organism appears again and again, its modules arranged in a pattern that changes less than its overall scale. These clues do not speak as plainly as a nest, an egg, or a seed. They require measurement and comparison, yet they are among the most important evidence for how Ediacaran organisms lived, because reproduction and growth reveal the rules by which a body enters a community and then spreads through it. For rangermorphs, growth often appears tied to modular construction. The body is not built as a single shapeless mass that expands evenly in all directions. It is assembled through repeated elements, and those elements create a record of development. In some forms, specimens of different size seem to hold the same number of visible modules. The smaller and larger versions are not different because one has added many more parts. They differ because the parts themselves appear to have expanded. This is sometimes described as inflation. The organism may begin with its basic module count established early, then grow by enlarging those repeated units. Such a pattern would make sense for a body whose exchange with seawater depends on surface arrangement. It allows the organism to preserve its overall proportions while increasing size, keeping the architecture coherent as it becomes more prominent on the seafloor. Other forms suggest a different rule. Charnia and some frond-like organisms appear to grow by adding modules, especially near a growing tip or along a central axis. In that case, the body becomes larger, not only because existing parts expand, but because new repeated elements are placed into the architecture. This kind of growth creates a different relationship between youth and maturity. A smaller individual may not be a miniature version of the adult in every detail. It may be a younger stage with fewer modules, still extending the pattern that will later define its larger form. The distinction between inflation and addition matters, because it shows that even within the rangermorphs, growth was not a single simple process. Similar-looking organisms could have followed different developmental pathways. Their shared strangeness can hide a deeper variety in how bodies were built. Reproduction adds a second layer to the puzzle. For a long time, one plausible idea was that rangermorphs release small propagules into the water, somewhat like corals or other marine organisms that send tiny dispersing stages away from the parent. In such a model, a mature organism produces a bud or reproductive particle that enters the water column, travels with currents, settles elsewhere, and begins to grow. This would explain how fixed organisms could colonize new surfaces even though the adults themselves did not move. It would also allow wide dispersal across suitable mat grounds, but the rock record gives limited direct evidence for such waterborne reproduction. Tiny early stages are hard to recognize, and delicate propagules may not preserve at all. The idea remains possible, yet it does not fully explain the spatial patterns seen on some bedding planes, especially where individuals occur in clusters around larger specimens. Those clusters suggest that at least some reproduction may have been more local. Fractifusus is especially important here because its distribution has been studied across fossil surfaces. Large individuals can be surrounded by medium-sized ones, and those medium-sized individuals can be associated with still smaller examples. The pattern resembles a hierarchy of spacing rather than a random scattering. In living systems, such arrangements can arise when offspring remain near the parent, perhaps connected at first by a stolon-like extension. A stolon is a runner or stem that grows outward from an adult and produces a new individual at some distance away. Many colonial or mat-associated organisms use comparable strategies in water. The important point is the spatial logic. If new individuals budded or rooted near an older one, the fossil surface might preserve clusters of related growth stages, with size and distance forming a pattern of reproductive spread. This possibility changes the way a dense surface is read. A crowd of similar forms may not simply be a population that arrived from drifting propagules. It may be a local expansion, a set of repeated individuals spreading across mat space. At the same time, local reproduction alone may not be enough. If every offspring remained close to its parent, a lineage would spread slowly and might struggle to reach newly available surfaces after burial, disturbance, or environmental change. A combined strategy is therefore possible. Some rangeomorphs may have reproduced both locally and through dispersal. They may have sent propagules into the water to colonize distant areas while also expanding across a surface through nearby budding or runner-like growth. This would be a powerful solution for an immobile organism. It would allow persistence in a stable patch and escape beyond that patch. It would fill local space efficiently while still reaching new seafloors when ash burial or sedimentation ended the old one. The fossil record cannot yet show every step, but the combination fits the ecological problem. A fixed, soft body must solve not only how to feed, but how to place its descendants in a world where the adult cannot choose a new location by moving. Growth and reproduction therefore connect directly to community structure. The earliest colonizers of a fresh mat surface may have been those that dispersed widely and settled quickly. Once established, they could spread locally, producing clusters or dense fields. Later, as space became occupied and currents moved around standing bodies, other forms might enter and create a more diverse community. A bedding plane dominated by a single morph may record a moment soon after colonization, when reproductive expansion outpaced ecological variety. A more mixed surface may record a later stage. After repeated settlement events and growth strategies overlapped, the seafloor becomes not a static display, but a frozen stage in a longer process of arrival, expansion, crowding, and replacement. Even the size of individuals can reflect timing. A surface with many small specimens may have been buried not long after recruitment. A surface with many large bodies may have persisted longer before ash or sediment closed over it. A surface with several size classes may record ongoing reproduction, with generations or growth stages present together. These interpretations are careful rather than final, but they show how much life history can be drawn from arrangement. In the Ediacaran, where anatomy is often ambiguous, the pattern of a population becomes one of the clearest signs of biology. Growth also places constraints on form. A body that feeds by absorbing dissolved material cannot simply become thicker without consequence. As a rangeomorph enlarges, It has to maintain access between living tissue and surrounding seawater. Module inflation must preserve enough surface exposure. Module addition must avoid burying older tissue inside the structure. The developmental system and the feeding system are therefore linked. A shape is successful only if growth does not break the exchange that made the shape viable. This may explain why repeated branching was so useful. It allowed organisms to increase size while preserving a fine-scale relationship with water. It gave development a rule that could scale upward without immediately demanding a mouth, gut, or circulatory system. The organism could become larger by elaborating the same surface logic that sustained its smaller form. That is a subtle kind of biological economy. Rather than inventing many specialized organs, the body repeats a unit that already works. The cost is dependence on a narrow environment. The benefit is enough success to cover seafloors for millions of years. Reproductive patterns also suggest that these organisms were not passive accidents of chemistry. They had life cycles, however unfamiliar. They began small. They grew according to organized rules. They produced new individuals. They occupied space in ways that affected the next generation. Their communities were shaped by timing, dispersal, local spread, and burial. The absence of muscles or mouths does not mean the absence of biological strategy. It means the strategies have to be inferred from quieter evidence. A cluster around a parent can be as meaningful as a trackway, though it records a different kind of action. A repeated module can be as revealing as a limb, though it speaks of development rather than movement. In these soft signals, the first large organisms become less like isolated impressions and more like populations with histories. They didn't merely appear on the mat. They arrived, expanded, matured, and left descendants close by or far away. Their bodies were built through repeated decisions made by growth, and their communities were shaped by reproductive placement. The patterns around the parent are therefore not incidental. They are one of the few remaining traces of life continuing through time, a record of how an organism without obvious motion could still spread across the dark sea floor and make the next generation part of the same quiet geometry. Beyond the dark sea floors of Avalon, the Ediacaran begins to lose any chance of being a single, tidy world. The fossils from Newfoundland are extraordinary because they preserve deep communities with rangeomorphs spread across ash-covered bedding plains, but they represent only one view into the period. Other regions show other bodies, other depths, other kinds of sediment, and other stages in time. When the record widens to the White Sea, to South Australia, to Namibia, and to additional localities across the world, the Ediacaran no longer appears as one stable ecosystem waiting to be replaced by the Cambrian. It becomes a changing interval with several biological experiments unfolding under different environmental conditions. The Avalon assemblage, best known from Newfoundland and related deep water settings, contains many of the oldest large Ediacaran communities. Its organisms are often attached, modular, and rangeomorph dominated. They belong to a world where the seafloor is dark, map-bound and comparatively undisturbed. In that world, the most important ecological questions concern surface area, height, attachment, chemical exchange, and community spacing. But the White Sea assemblage shifts the scene. These fossils, known especially from Russia and also represented in other regions, tend to occur in shallower marine settings and include forms that seem more animal-like in their organization. Dickinsonia lies among the most famous of them, a broad-ribbed body with a repeated pattern running along its length. It does not look like a modern animal in any simple way, but it has a front-to-back organization that feels different from the branching rangeomorphs. Kimberella adds another layer of difference, because it appears with traces that suggest movement and feeding activity, perhaps scratching or grazing on microbial mats. Other forms in these assemblages show bilateral symmetry, the organisation in which the left and right sides of the body mirror one another around a central line. Bilateral symmetry matters because it is common among active animals that move directionally through their environments. A body with a front and a back can interact with the world in a different way from a body fixed in place. It can encounter food, avoid disturbed patches, and leave traces of its behaviour in sediment. This does not mean every white sea organism is easy to classify, or that each one is a direct ancestor of later animals. It means that the range of Ediacaran life expands beyond the quiet attached communities of Avalon. Movement becomes more visible, mat grazing becomes more plausible. Body plans begin to point towards some of the ecological patterns that will become clearer in the Cambrian. The Nama assemblage, known especially from Namibia, changes the picture again. Here the seafloor includes organisms such as ernietomorphs, built from quilted tubular units arranged into forms that may have rested partly within or upon sediment. These bodies are not rangermorphs, yet they share the broader Ediacaran tendency to build large, soft forms from repeated modules. Namibia also preserves Claudina, a small tubular organism with a more rigid outer structure made of nested elements. Claudina is important because it marks a move towards skeletonization, though not yet the fully developed skeletal world of the Cambrian. Its tubes could form reef-like accumulations, showing that some late Ediacaran organisms were beginning to alter the physical seafloor in new ways. The appearance of harder parts also introduces new ecological pressure. Skeletons can support a body, lift it from sediment, control its growth shape, and offer protection. They may also reflect a world in which predation or environmental stress is becoming more important. If soft-fixed organisms once occupied mat grounds with relatively little threat from active consumers, the late Ediacaran no longer looks so gentle. The Nama record suggests a seafloor with more engineering, more structure, and perhaps more conflict. Taken together, Avalon, White Sea, and Nama seem at first to form a simple sequence through depth. Avalon appears deepest, White Sea shallower, Nama shallower still. In that arrangement, the differences among fossils might be explained mostly by environment. Deep dark settings favour attached rangermorphs, shallower mat grounds support mobile grazers, still shallower carbonate or mixed settings allow tubes, reefs, and more rigid bodies. This environmental explanation is useful, but it is not enough. Time runs through the pattern as well. Avalon-style communities tend to be older. White Sea assemblages appear later. Nama assemblages are generally closer to the end of the Ediacaran and therefore nearer to the Cambrian transition. This means that the differences may record evolution, not just habitat. New body plans may be appearing, older forms may be declining or shifting. Mobile animals may be increasing their ecological influence. Skeletonized organisms may be entering the system as ocean chemistry, and biological interactions change. The difficulty is that environment and time are not easily separated. A fossil found in deep water and older rock may differ from a shallow younger fossil because it lived in a different habitat, because it came from an earlier biological stage, or because both are true at once. This is one of the central challenges of Ediacaran paleontology. The record is broad enough to reveal pattern, but uneven enough to resist a single cause. A bedding plane in Newfoundland cannot stand for the whole planet. A shallow assemblage in Russia cannot erase the deep water world that came before it. Namibia cannot be treated only as a late chapter if its environment also preserved organisms differently from the others. Each locality is a real place with its own sediment, chemistry, burial history, and ecological conditions. The global story must be built by comparing these places without flattening them into one line. Preservation adds still another complication. Avalon fossils are often preserved beneath volcanic ash, capturing entire surfaces with fine relief. White sea fossils may be preserved through different sedimentary processes on mat-covered seafloors. Nama fossils can occur in sandstones, limestones, and other deposits that favour different kinds of bodies and different parts of bodies. The same organism can look different depending on whether it is preserved from above, below, in relief, as an impression, as a cast, or as a partial structure. Aspidella once looked like an isolated disc, but in some contexts it is understood as a holdfast, the base of a larger frond. This is a warning for the broader assemblages. Some differences between regions may be biological, others may be taphonomic, meaning they arise from the process of fossilization. A soft organism buried under ash may preserve branching detail. The same kind of organism in a different sediment may leave only a vague outline, a disc, or nothing recognizable at all. A tubular organism with a more rigid structure may be overrepresented simply because it survives preservation more readily. The record therefore blends life with the conditions of recording life. Still, even after these cautions, the regional differences are too strong to dismiss. The Ediacaran truly changes across space and time. Avalon shows large, mostly immobile communities that do not easily fit into modern animal categories. White sea assemblages bring more evidence of bilateral bodies, movement, and mat-based feeding. Nama assemblages include quilted forms, tubular organisms, reef-like structures, and signs of increasing ecological complexity near the period's end. The progression is not a simple march toward modern animals, but it does show a world becoming less dominated by one kind of soft-bodied experiment and more crowded with competing strategies. The seafloor is no longer only a surface for attachment and passive exchange. It becomes a place to cross, scrape, burrow, build, and possibly defend. That shift matters because ecosystems are shaped not only by what organisms are, but by what they do to the environment around them. A fixed rangeomorph modifies flow and occupies space. A grazer removes microbial mat. A burrower changes sediment structure. A tube builder creates hard relief. A skeletonized organism changes the rules of preservation and survival. The Ediacaran assemblages show these actions appearing unevenly, first as hints, then as stronger patterns. Beyond Avalon, the period therefore becomes less quiet, not because its mystery becomes louder, but because more kinds of life are entering the same geological frame. The ancient Earth is testing different relationships between body and seafloor attached and absorbing, mobile and grazing, quilted and reclining, tubular and rigid, soft and patterned, animal-like and not quite animal. Some of these relationships will lead toward Cambrian ecosystems. Others will end without clear descendants. The important point is that they coexist within the last chapter of the Precambrian, overlapping through a world whose oceans, chemistry, and sediments are still changing. The Ediacaran is not a single lost garden. It is a sequence of marine provinces, each with its own rules, each preserving a different answer to the question of how large life could live before the modern animal world fully took hold. Avalon gives the story its dark beginning. The White Sea and Nama show that the beginning did not remain unchanged. By the time the period nears its close, the seafloor is no longer only holding soft forms in place. It is beginning to register motion, construction, disturbance, and the first pressures of a more restless biosphere. Preservation is not a neutral window. It is more like a lens shaped by sediment, chemistry, decay, pressure, and chance. And in the Ediacaran, that lens can change the organism almost as much as it reveals it. A soft body on a microbial mat does not become a fossil simply because it once lived. It has to pass through a narrow sequence of conditions before stone can hold even part of its form. The body must be buried before it collapses too far. The sediment must be fine enough to record detail, or chemically active enough to stabilize an impression. Microbial films may have to bind the surface. Minerals may have to form in the right place at the right time. Later, the rock must split along a surface that exposes the fossil rather than cutting through it in confusion. By the time a paleontologist sees the result, the ancient organism has already been translated many times. It has moved from living tissue into decaying matter, from decaying matter into sediment relief, from relief into rock, from rock into weathered exposure, and from exposure into interpretation. Each translation can preserve something, erase something, or make one body look like another. This is why the Ediacaran is so difficult to classify. Many of its fossils are not bodies in the full anatomical sense. They are surfaces of contact, undersides, impressions, moulds, casts, or partial reliefs left after the organism and sediment interacted. A frond lying beneath ash may preserve its branching structure with remarkable delicacy. The same kind of organism viewed only from the base may appear as a disc. A body pressed into sand may show broad outline but lose fine modules. A form preserved in limestone may retain a tube or wall while losing soft extensions. The difference between organisms and the difference between preservational styles can overlap so strongly that one can be mistaken for the other. Aspidella gives a clear warning: treated alone. A circular fossil can look like a complete disc-shaped organism. Seen in richer contexts, some discs become holdfasts, anchoring structures at the base of frond-like organisms. The fossil did not lie. It preserved a real structure. The mistake came from assuming that the preserved part was the whole creature. This problem recurs throughout the period. A fossil may represent the underside rather than the upper surface. It may show the footprint of a body after decay rather than the body itself. It may flatten a three-dimensional organism into a plan view, making height, thickness, and curvature difficult to recover. It may preserve a community in place, or it may preserve remains that shifted slightly before burial. Even at an exceptional locality, the evidence is not complete. It is merely unusually generous. The phrase preservation bias describes this unevenness, but the term can sound too small for what is happening. Bias does not mean the record is useless. It means the record has preferences. It favours some environments, some body types, some burial processes, and some moments over others. Volcanic ash at Avalon localities favours broad bedding plane snapshots of soft organisms living on deep mat grounds. Mat-associated sandstones can preserve impressions of organisms that rested or moved on microbial surfaces. Carbonate settings may preserve tubular or more rigid forms with better clarity than soft sheets. Deep-water quiet settings may capture attached communitors, while energetic shallow settings may erase delicate bodies but preserve traces of movement or more robust structures. The result is a fossil record that may seem to show biological provinces, when some part of the difference may come from what each province was able to record. This does not make the Avalon, White Sea, and Nama assemblages artificial. They are real patterns in real rocks, but it makes them harder to compare. An apparent absence in one place may mean the organism did not live there, or it may mean the environment failed to preserve it. An apparent first appearance may mark an evolutionary origin, or it may mark the first time preservation became favourable. An apparent disappearance may signal extinction, migration, ecological decline, or the closing of a preservational window. In the Ediacaran, all of these possibilities have to remain close to the surface. The bodies themselves intensify the problem because many were soft and unfamiliar. A trilobite shell can be broken and still recognized as part of a trilobite. A rangemorph impression, damaged or incomplete, may lose the very features needed to identify it. If modular branching is blurred, a distinctive organism can become an anonymous oval or streak. If a holdfast is preserved without its stem or frond, it may become a disk of uncertain origin. If a quilted body is compressed in an unusual way, its three-dimensional form may be reconstructed in more than one plausible shape. Ediacaran fossils often require interpretation from the distribution of relief, the angle of repeated elements, the relationship between fossils and sedimentary structures, and the comparison of many specimens across many surfaces. A single specimen can be beautiful and misleading. A population can reveal what one impression hides. This is why the discovery of new fossils often changes older interpretations. A newly found specimen may connect a disc to a stalk, show a frond preserved in an unexpected style, or place an organism in an environment where an earlier interpretation no longer works. Recent finds in different rock types have been especially useful because they break the old association between a body plan and a single preservational mode. When an organism once known mainly from one kind of deposit appears in another, it becomes possible to separate what belongs to the creature from what belongs to the rock. A frond preserved in a Nama-style setting, or an ernietomorph appearing in deeper water, complicates the tidy boundaries that once made the assemblages seem more distinct. These complications are not failures of the science, they are progress. They show the record becoming dense enough to expose its own distortions. The microbial mat remains central to this issue, because it acted both as habitat and preservational partner. A mat can hold sediment together, slow decay at the interface, and create chemical microenvironments that encourage mineral films or impressions to persist. But mats also bias the record toward organisms that lived on them or interacted with them. A creature that swam above the seafloor with no hard parts might leave no trace at all. A small animal moving inside the upper mat might leave a burrow but no body. A soft organism living away from rapid burial might disappear completely, even if it was ecologically important. The Ediacaran seas could have contained many organisms that are almost invisible now, not because they were rare, but because they lacked a route into stone. This gap matters when trying to reconstruct ecosystems. The visible forms may have been dominant, or they may be only the preservable part of a broader living community. Paleontologists therefore read Ediacaran rocks with a double attention. One eye stays on biology, asking what the organism was, how it grew, how it fed, and where it belongs in the history of life. The other stays on preservation, asking what the rock could preserve, what it could not preserve, and how the fossil's shape may have been altered before discovery. This double attention creates a slower and more cautious kind of understanding. It resists the desire to name every form quickly. It accepts that a fossil may be both clear and incomplete. It allows the same evidence to be reorganized when a new surface or a new locality appears. The reward is a richer picture of the period, one in which uncertainty is not treated as emptiness, but as part of the structure of the evidence. Preservation bias also softens the boundary between biological mystery and geological process. The question of what happened to the Ediacaran biota at the end of the period cannot be answered only by counting fossils. If microbial mats declined because animals grazed and burrowed through them, then the organisms that depended on mat ground preservation might vanish from the record even before every lineage vanished from life. If sedimentary conditions changed, soft impressions might become rarer while trace fossils and skeletons became more common. A disappearing fossil style can look like a disappearing world. Sometimes it is both. The difficulty is determining how much of each is present. This makes the Ediacaran ending more subtle than a simple extinction horizon. It may involve real ecological loss, increasing animal competition, changing chemistry, and the closing of the very conditions that once allowed soft bodies to be recorded. The rock changes the creature, and then the changing seafloor changes the rock's ability to remember creatures at all. That is the hidden bias at the centre of the period. The fossils are honest, but their honesty is partial. They preserve surfaces, not complete lives. They reveal communities, but only where burial cooperated. They show strange bodies, while sometimes hiding the ordinary parts that might have made them easier to classify. They let the same organism appear as a disc, a frond, a quilt, or a shadow, depending on how sediment met tissue. To study them is to study life and its translation into geology at the same time. The Ediacaran record is therefore not a simple gallery of ancient organisms. It is an archive of contact between soft bodies and unstable seafloors, and the next forms to enter that archive will be recognized less by their bodies than by the marks they left while moving. The first moving animals announce themselves quietly, not with skeletons or sudden predatory scenes, but with disturbed surfaces on ancient mats. In the Ediacaran record, motion is often easier to recognize than the body that made it, because movement leaves a pattern even when soft tissue disappears. A trail crossing a microbial surface can preserve the direction of travel. A set of repeated impressions can show where a body rested, fed, then shifted forward. A scratch beside a fossil can imply a feeding organ that the body itself does not clearly preserve. These are trace fossils, records of behavior rather than bodies, and they become increasingly important as the Ediacaran seafloor begins to change. The older rangeomorph communities at places such as Mistaken Point are dominated by organisms fixed in place, attached to mat grounds, and shaped for exchange with the surrounding water. Later Ediacaran surfaces reveal a different relationship between life and sediment. Something begins to cross the mat, something grazes, something avoids already used patches, something enters the top layers of the seafloor and leaves behind small curving marks. The body may be lost, but the behavior remains. This is one reason the first moving animals are not always recognized by their anatomy alone. They are recognized by what they did. Dickinsonia is one of the clearest and most debated bodies in this transition. It appears as a broad, flattened, ribbed organism, often oval or elongate, with repeated segments or units arranged along its length. For many years, it moved through interpretations almost as much as it may once have moved across the seafloor. It was compared with worms, jellyfish, fungi, lichens, extinct groups, and organisms outside familiar categories. Its body looked ordered, but not comfortably modern. The important change came when fossils were considered together with the traces associated with them. In some deposits, Dickinsonia appears near repeated impressions that resemble resting or feeding marks, as if the organism settled onto the microbial mat, processed the surface beneath it, then shifted to another place and did the same again. The pattern suggests a creature interacting directly with the mat rather than floating passively or remaining fixed. Some chemical evidence has also supported an animal interpretation, though the details remain carefully studied. What matters in the larger Ediacaran story is that Dickinsonia shows a body no longer defined only by attachment. It lies on the seafloor as a mobile presence, broad against the mat, leaving a record of repeated contact. Its movement may not have been fast. It may not have involved obvious legs, fins, or a head like later animals. But even slow motion changes an ecosystem. A surface that can be crossed and consumed is not the same as a surface that only supports attached life. Cambrian sharpens that change. Its body fossils are often described as mollusk-like, not because it was necessarily a direct early mollusk in any simple sense, but because it had a more definite body organization and appears with feeding traces that suggest active scraping. Near some Cambrian specimens, scratch-like marks occur on microbial mat surfaces. These marks have been interpreted as evidence that the organism used a proboscis or rasping structure to disturb and feed from the mat. If that reconstruction is broadly correct, then Cambrian was not merely absorbing dissolved matter or passively resting on a surface. It was applying a tool-like part of its body to the seafloor. That is a different ecological act, Scraping concentrates feeding. It turns the mat into a patchy resource. It creates exhausted zones and fresh zones. It rewards orientation, contact, and perhaps some ability to sense where food remains. The animal does not need to be complex by later standards for this to matter. A simple grazer can still change the rules for every organism that depends on an intact background. The same fabric that helped preserve Ediacaran bodies becomes a food source for mobile ones. This makes Cambriella important not only as a possible early animal, but as a sign that behaviour itself is beginning to reorganise the seafloor. Body fossils like Dickinsonia and Cambriella give names and outlines to this transition. But many of the most revealing animals are known only through traces. Tiny burrows and shallow trails appear in late Ediacaran rocks, some only millimetres across, made by organisms too small or too delicate to preserve as clear bodies. In the Mackenzie Mountains of northwestern Canada, such traces provide a detailed view of changing behaviour. The marks can pass in and out of relief on a rock slab, showing that the animal moved through the uppermost layers of a microbial mat or just beneath its surface. At first, many of these trails look aimless, wandering through the mat as if the animal simply grazed wherever its body happened to go. This apparently simple motion is already significant. A burrow is a physical intrusion into sediment. It breaks the sealed quality of the mat. It moves material. It creates a path where none existed before. Even the shallowest grazing trail marks a shift from living on the seafloor to entering it. Over time, the traces become more organised. Some trails approach an earlier path, then turn away instead of crossing it. This behaviour is known as phobotaxis, an avoidance of already disturbed or used areas. The word is technical, but the meaning is plain. The animal is not moving entirely at random. It responds to the condition of the sediment or mat in front of it. It avoids places where food may already have been removed. In younger Ediacaran rocks, the pattern becomes stronger and more repeated. Burrows begin to form meanders, sweeping back and forth across the surface and closer. More efficient curves. When a trail runs near a previous path without crossing it, the behaviour is called thigmotaxis, movement guided by contact or proximity to an existing boundary. The result can look surprisingly deliberate, like a tiny agricultural pattern cut into ancient sediment. The animal has no visible face in the fossil record, no brain is preserved, no sensory organ can be seen. Yet the trace implies a simple sensory world. The organism detects something about the surface, perhaps chemical depletion, texture, or the edge of a previous burrow, and changes direction. That is a profound clue. The beginnings of animal behaviour are not only found in larger bodies, they are found in decisions written as grooves. Efficient meandering matters because feeding on a nutrient-poor mat rewards coverage. A random path can miss patches and waste energy by crossing areas already grazed. A guided path increases contact with fresh food while reducing unnecessary overlap. Modern animals in low-nutrient sediments can leave comparable patterns for similar reasons. The Ediacaran traces show that some early animals were already solving this problem. They were not thinking in the human sense, and it would be misleading to imagine intention as if they planned a route. But natural selection can shape simple sensory and motor systems into efficient behaviours. A tiny animal that avoids depleted sediment gains more food for the same effort. Over many generations, such behaviour can become more regular. The fossil record captures the outcome as increasingly patterned trails. This is where the story of movement begins to lean toward the later animal world. Motion leads to feeding strategy. Feeding strategy leads to sensory response. Sensory response leads to more organised interaction with the environment. The seafloor stops being merely a place where bodies are placed and becomes a field of information for attached Ediacaran organisms. The main challenge may have been exposure to flow, access to dissolved nutrients, and stable attachment. For mobile animals, the challenge includes choosing where to go, where not to go, and how to avoid wasting effort. That choice, even in a simple biological form, opens a new ecological dimension. It also begins to erode the mat ground world that older communities depended on. Grazing removes microbial layers. Burrowing loosens sediment. Repeated movement introduces oxygen into shallow layers and changes the chemistry of the sediment-water boundary. The earliest traces are small, but their consequences accumulate. A mat once smooth and continuous becomes cut by paths, patches, feeding marks, and shallow disturbances. For some organisms, this creates opportunity. For others, it creates instability. The transition is not immediate, and the Ediacaran still contains fixed, soft-bodied forms alongside mobile ones, but the balance is shifting. Dickinsonia, Kimberella, and tiny trace makers show that animals were not merely present as bodies, they were becoming agents, organisms that altered the surfaces they used. Their actions foreshadow the more intensive bioturbation of the Cambrian, when burrowing would become deeper, more common, and more disruptive. In the Ediacaran, the change is still delicate enough to preserve its first stages. A broad body moves from one mat patch to another. A scraper leaves marks beside its fossil. A small burrow bends away from a used path. These are modest traces, but they carry a large implication. The history of animals is not only the history of new anatomy, it is the history of behavior entering sediment, of bodies beginning to read and rewrite the ground beneath them. Once that begins, the old seafloor can no longer remain only a living fabric. It becomes a landscape of feeding decisions, and each shallow groove brings the Cambrian a little closer. In the Mackenzie Mountains, the evidence for early animal behavior is not preserved as a body with organs arranged inside it, but as a narrow disturbance on the surface of ancient sediment. The marks are small enough to seem modest at first. They curve, wander, disappear into the rock, then return in a different relief, as though something soft once moved through the upper skin of a microbial mat and left only the memory of its path. What makes these traces important is not their size, it is their order through time. In older examples, the trails often look irregular, as if the animal grazed wherever the mat allowed it to move. The route does not show a strong pattern. It crosses available surface with little obvious concern for efficiency. In younger Ediacaran rocks, the same broad kind of activity begins to change. A path approaches an earlier path and bends away. Another runs near a previous groove without cutting through it. Still later, trails tighten into repeated curves, forming meanders that cover the surface more completely while avoiding places already disturbed. The body that made the mark may be gone, but the pattern of motion remains, and that pattern suggests a quiet transformation in the way animals were beginning to sense their world. It is tempting to speak of intelligence here, but the word has to be used with restraint. These were not animals with thoughts in any human sense, and the fossils do not preserve brains. They preserve behavior. Behavior is broader and older than conscious planning. A bacterium can move toward a chemical, a single-celled organism can respond to light, a simple animal can contract, turn, pause, or continue according to signals from its surroundings. The Ediacaran traces show that some early animals were doing more than pushing blindly through sediment. They were reacting to information, even if the information was simple where the mat had already been grazed, where the texture had changed. Where chemical rewards were lower, where the edge of an earlier burrow lay close enough to guide a turn. A nervous system does not have to be elaborate for such responses to matter. Even a small set of sensory cells and coordinated muscles can turn a random search into a more efficient pattern. The trace fossil becomes a record of that coordination, a behavioral fossil in which the animal's vanished body is replaced by the route it took. The ecological reason for this change is straightforward. A microbial mat is a patchy resource. Once an animal grazes through a patch, that path may contain less food than the surrounding surface. Returning to it immediately wastes effort. Crossing it may expose the animal to sediment already depleted or disturbed. Avoiding it allows more fresh mat to be contacted for the same energy cost. This is why meandering matters. A tight, organized path can cover space efficiently. Much as a grazing animal on land benefits from moving across unvisited ground rather than repeatedly returning to the same bare patch. In the Ediacaran Sea, the scale is far smaller and the organism much simpler. But the underlying problem is the same. Energy is limited. Food is unevenly distributed. Movement has a cost. Natural selection favours patterns that increase reward and reduce waste. The youngest Ediacaran meanders do not need to imply complex thought. They imply that behaviour had become shaped enough to leave a recognisable strategy behind. This strategy also changes the meaning of the seafloor. For attached rangeomorphs, the mat was a stable foundation, and perhaps a partner in preservation. For mobile grazers and burrowers, it became a surface to be read. A previously disturbed groove was no longer just sediment. It was information about the recent past of the animal's own activity, or the activity of another. A fresh patch of mat was not simply ground. It was potential food. A boundary between used and unused surface became a guide. In that sense, the Ediacaran seafloor was becoming cognitive terrain, not because it held minds like later vertebrate minds, but because animals were beginning to act as if the surface contained signals worth responding to. This is a major step in the history of animal life. Anatomy makes bodies possible, but behaviour gives bodies a way to negotiate their surroundings. A mouth can feed, but it feeds better if the animal can find useful places. A muscle can move, but movement becomes more valuable if direction matters. A sensory cell can detect a difference, but that difference becomes ecological only when it changes what the body does next. The early tracemakers bring these pieces together in their simplest visible form. The grooves also show how behaviour accumulates into environmental change. A single shallow trail barely alters a seafloor. Many trails begin to fragment a mat. Organised grazing can remove microbial surfaces more thoroughly than random wandering. Burrowing introduces sediment mixing. Even if the earliest burrows are shallow, it opens tiny pathways for water and oxygen. It disturbs the layered chemistry that mats maintain. As this activity spreads, the mat ground becomes less continuous. The old Ediacaran surface, once suitable for attachment, impression, and passive exchange, starts to break into patches. The disturbance is not yet the deep churning associated with many Cambrian sediments, but it points toward that later condition. The earliest behavioural organisation therefore has consequences beyond the animal itself. A more efficient grazer changes its habitat faster. A more patterned burrower can transform the food field it depends upon. The same adaptation that helps one animal feed may make the seafloor less stable for organisms anchored nearby. This is one of the subtle pressures building near the end of the Ediacaran. The rise of behaviour is also the rise of ecological engineering. The comparison with later brains must remain careful. Brains are expensive tissues, and large complex brains belong to a much later history. The Ediacaran traces suggest something more foundational, the beginning of sensory motor loops. A sensory motor loop is the cycle in which an organism detects a condition, sends that information through its body, and produces an action in response. Even very simple loops can create surprisingly organised behaviour. If a burrowing animal detects depleted sediment and turns away, the resulting path can look purposeful without requiring anything like reflection. Over time, repeated loops can produce a patterned record in stone. The fossil is therefore not a fossil brain, but it is evidence that bodies were becoming coordinated around feedback. This feedback may have involved chemical gradients, touch, resistance in the sediment, oxygen levels, or the physical boundary of a previous trail. The exact signal is hard to know. The larger point is that signals were being used. In the deep history of life, that is a profound development. It marks the seafloor as a place where organisms did not merely endure conditions but adjusted to them moment by moment. The Mackenzie Mountain traces become especially valuable because they show a stepwise pattern rather than a single isolated example. Simple grazing appears first, avoidance appears later. More complex meandering follows. The sequence does not prove a single lineage becoming smarter in a straight line, but it does show that late Ediacaran ecosystems were accumulating behavioral complexity. Different animals may have contributed different traces. Environments may have encouraged different search strategies. Preservation may emphasize some patterns over others, yet the overall direction is hard to miss. The marks become less random. The use of space becomes more efficient. The sediment records an increasing ability to respond to the results of previous movement. This is the behavioral counterpart to the anatomical changes seen elsewhere in the period. Bilateral bodies suggest directionality. Scratches suggest feeding tools. Tubes and skeletons suggest new physical relationships with the environment. Patterned burrows suggest the internal coordination needed to make movement more than drift. Together, these developments show the Ediacaran moving toward a world in which animals do not simply occupy ecosystems, they modify them through repeated acts. There is a quietness to this evidence that makes it easy to overlook. A groove on a slab lacks the visual power of a skeleton or a spectacular soft-bodied impression. It does not show the animal's face because there may have been no face in the later sense. It does not display organs, colour, or size, yet it preserves something equally important, a decision made by a body, not a conscious decision, but a biological one, shaped by sensation, energy, and the need to feed. The animal came near a used patch and turned. It followed a boundary. It made another curve. It left a pattern that would later be sealed, buried, lifted, and split open by erosion. In that pattern, the earliest traces of animal behaviour become visible as a kind of thinking before thought, an organisation of movement that belongs to nerves, muscles, mats, and hunger rather than to language or memory. By the end of the Ediacaran, this seafloor holds more of these signals. It is no longer only a place where soft organisms attach in stillness. It is a surface being explored, processed, avoided, and rewritten. The old mat ground remains present, but it now carries the first signs of a more active biosphere, one in which life begins to shape space through behaviour. From such shallow grooves, the later animal world will inherit one of its defining powers, the ability to turn perception into action, and action into a changed planet. The pressure that builds near the end of the Ediacaran is not the pressure of one event arriving all at once. It is a slow tightening of ecological relationships, chemical changes, and animal behaviours until the old mat ground world begins to lose the conditions that made it possible. For much of the earlier Ediacaran, broad microbial surfaces could remain stable enough for soft-bodied organisms to attach, spread, feed, and be preserved. Rangemorphs and other fixed forms belong to that kind of seafloor, one in which sediment was often sealed by living films and not yet deeply reworked by animals. But the later Ediacaran introduces a different rhythm. Grazers cross the mat. Small burrowers enter the upper sediment. Some organisms develop more rigid external structures. Trace fossils diversify. Feeding becomes more active. Surfaces that once acted like stable platforms begin to fray under repeated contact. The shift is subtle in its earliest expression. but its direction is unmistakable. The seafloor is becoming less like a quiet living carpet and more like a worked environment, a place where bodies do not merely rest or stand, but disturb, process, excavate, and sometimes damage one another. Burrowing is central to this change because it alters sediment from within. A microbial mat depends on continuity. Its layers hold together through growth, binding, and chemical gradients. When an animal moves through that surface, even shallowly, it opens a path, mixes grains, introduces water into places that were previously more sealed, and disrupts the small chemical zones that microbes maintain. At first, these burrows are tiny, grazing just below or within the topmost mat. They do not overturn the whole seafloor, yet small disturbances repeated across many surfaces can change the balance between mat growth and mat removal. If microbial films recover faster than animals consume them, the old mat ground persists. If animals graze and burrow faster than mats can rebuild, the surface becomes patchier. Attached organisms that depend on a firm mat may find fewer secure places to anchor. Soft impressions may become less likely to preserve. Feeding trails and burrows begin to replace body impressions as the more common record of activity. The same innovation that opens a new food source for mobile animals therefore narrows the habitat for older Ediacaran communities. It is not necessary for every fixed organism to be eaten or killed directly. Habitat loss can be enough. A frond that once stood securely in a mat-bound sediment may become unstable if the surface beneath it is loosened, grazed, or broken by repeated movement. A holdfast needs a reliable boundary between body and ground. When that boundary becomes disturbed, attachment becomes more difficult. This creates a form of ecological replacement that is quieter than catastrophe. The old organisms do not have to vanish in a single dark pulse. They can decline as the surfaces they require become less common, less continuous, and less suited to their mode of life. At the same time, the organisms causing the disturbance may be small compared with the giants they help displace. A tiny burrower can participate in a planetary transition if its behavior becomes widespread. The Ediacaran ending, therefore, does not need to be imagined only as a battle between large visible bodies. It may also be a story of microscopic and millimetre-scale disruptions accumulating until the physical character of the seabed changes. Predation adds another pressure, although its earliest evidence is cautious and uneven. A world with soft, immobile bodies would offer vulnerable targets once animals capable of piercing, grazing, rasping, or consuming other organisms became more effective. Claudina, with its small tubular skeleton, preserves possible signs of attack in some specimens, suggesting that late Ediacaran ecosystems may have included predator-prey interactions more complex than those of earlier mat-ground communities. Even limited predation can change evolution. If some organisms are damaged or consumed, then defences become valuable. If defences become valuable, harder parts, tougher tissues, rapid growth, protective tubes, or new behaviours may be favoured. This can create an evolutionary feedback loop. Predators improve ways to attack. Prey improve ways to resist. The fossil record near the end of the Ediacaran begins to show hints of this new tension through skeletonization, boring marks, and increasing ecological differentiation. It is still not the fully armoured marine world of the Cambrian, but the direction has changed. Bodies are no longer interacting only through space, flow, and chemical exchange. They are beginning to interact through harm. Skeletons belong to the same transformation. The first rigid structures in the Ediacaran are not grand shells or heavy armour in the later Paleozoic sense. They are small tubes, nested cups, and mineralized or partly mineralized forms that suggest organisms were learning to use the chemistry of seawater to build harder boundaries around themselves. A skeleton can do several things at once. It It can support a body, raise it from the sediment, protect it from damage, and shape the way an organism grows. It can also change preservation, making some organisms more visible in the fossil record than their soft neighbours. Once skeletons become more common, the record begins to favour a different kind of life. This does not mean that all soft bodies disappear instantly. It means that the archive starts to tilt toward organisms with durable parts, while the ecosystems themselves may also tilt toward more active, competitive interactions. The rise of skeletonization is tied not only to predation, but also to ocean chemistry. To build mineral structures, organisms depend on the availability of ions in seawater, on acidity, on oxygen conditions, and on the biological machinery needed to control mineral growth. Late Ediacaran oceans were changing through complex carbon, sulfur, and oxygen cycles, and those chemical shifts may have made some kinds of biomineralization more possible or more advantageous. The exact relationship remains debated, but the broad connection is difficult to ignore. Life changes the ocean, and the ocean changes what life can build. As oxygen becomes more available in certain settings, larger and more active animals can support higher energy demands. As seawater chemistry shifts, mineral skeletons become more feasible. As skeletons and active feeding spread, ecological interactions become sharper. These processes reinforce one another without requiring a single master cause. The Cambrian pressure builds from many directions at once. It comes from chemistry, from behaviour, from competition, from preservation, and from the cumulative effects of organisms altering the surfaces they occupy. By the latest Ediacaran, the seafloor contains overlapping worlds. In some places, soft-bodied Ediacaran forms still persist on microbial mats. In others, mobile animals leave trails, burrows, and feeding marks. Tubular organisms build small, hard structures. Predation may begin to leave wounds. Sediments become more aerated and mixed. The old mat grounds shrink into patches rather than continuous carpets. This patchiness matters because it suggests the transition was not uniform. The Ediacaran didn't end everywhere in the same way at the same moment. Some environments may have remained refuges for older forms longer than others. Deep settings, quiet basins, or isolated mat grounds may have preserved Ediacaran-style life while shallower, more energetic, more animal-disturbed areas moved toward Cambrian conditions. The boundary between the two periods is therefore a geological marker, but the biological transformation was likely uneven. A map of the late Ediacaran world would not show a clean line between old and new. It would show mosaics attached soft communities here, mobile grazers there, skeletonized tubes elsewhere, and sediments passing through different degrees of disturbance. The more modern seafloor emerges from this mosaic by changing the default state of the bottom. Before widespread animal activity, a stable microbial mat can be normal. After widespread bioturbation, constant disturbance becomes normal. Sediment is mixed. Oxygen penetrates differently. Microbial films are grazed back, and the upper layers of the seabed become a habitat in themselves rather than a sealed boundary. This is sometimes described as an agronomic revolution, because early animals effectively farmed and processed microbial surfaces and sediments, increasing the complexity of feeding strategies. The term is metaphorical, but the transformation is real. Animals learned to use the seafloor as a resource in increasingly varied ways. They grazed, mined, stirred, suspended, deposited, and eventually hunted. Once this happens, any organism dependent on the older continuous mat ground faces a narrower future. The Ediacaran biota may therefore have been pressed from below by disturbed attachment surfaces, from around by mobile competitors, from above by changing water chemistry, and from direct contact by emerging predation. The old habitat frays not because the planet suddenly rejects it, but because too many small changes make its maintenance harder. The ending that follows is not simply disappearance. It is replacement of a world's operating rules. The organisms that had once thrived by standing in dark water, spreading across mats, absorbing through surfaces, or resting on stable microbial films found themselves sharing the seafloor with animals that made the ground less stable and food webs more active. In the Cambrian, those new rules would expand dramatically, producing more burrows, more skeletons, more predation, and more visible animal diversity. In the late Ediacaran, the first signs are already present. A groove cuts the mat, a tube hardens, a trace avoids a used patch, a soft frond loses the kind of ground it once required. The transformation is written not as one violent sentence, but as many small edits across the seafloor, until the page that preserved the Ediacaran begins to record a different world. The disappearance of the Ediacaran biota is difficult because the word disappearance can hide several different endings inside one calm surface. A fossil group can vanish because the organisms themselves die out. It can vanish because the environments that preserve them change. It can vanish because a few survivors become rare, small, displaced, or anatomically altered enough that they no longer look like their older relatives. Near the boundary with the Cambrian, all of these possibilities press against one another. The great soft-bodied communities that once spread across mat grounds do not simply continue unchanged into the next world. Rangemorphs fade. Many quilted and disc-like forms become scarce or absent. The familiar Ediacaran surfaces, where ash and microbial mats could hold whole communities in delicate relief, become less common. At the same time, traces of animal movement grow more varied. Skeletonized tubes appear, predation becomes more plausible, and sediments begin to carry the marks of a more restless biosphere. Something real is ending. The difficulty is deciding how much of that ending belongs to extinction, how much belongs to ecological replacement, and how much belongs to the closing of a fossil window that had once made soft bodies visible. The simplest explanation is preservation loss. If microbial mats helped preserve Ediacaran organisms, and if later animals grazed, burrowed, and disturbed those mats, then the conditions required to record soft impressions would decline. In that view, the Ediacaran biota may seem to disappear partly because the seafloor stopped remembering it in the same way. A mat-covered surface can hold a body impression beneath ash or sediment. A churned surface cannot do this as easily. Once burrowers break the mat, once grazers remove microbial films, once sediment is mixed and aerated, the archive changes. This idea is powerful because it explains why the loss of body fossils coincides with the rise of trace fossils and more disturbed sediment. It also respects the fragility of the organisms themselves. A soft rangemorph without a skeleton needs exceptional conditions to enter stone. Remove those conditions, and its lineage could become almost invisible even before it fully dies out. Yet preservation loss alone does not feel sufficient. The Ediacaran world was not only recorded differently near its end, it was being lived differently. Mobile animals were not just erasing fossils after death, they were changing habitats during life. Burrowing made mat grounds patchier, grazing reduced microbial surfaces. Active feeding created competition for resources that fixed osmotrophic or mat-dependent organisms could not easily answer. The rise of skeletons and possible predation introduced direct biological pressures. If a soft, immobile body is surrounded by organisms that can scrape, penetrate, consume, or destabilize its attachment surface, its survival becomes harder even if preservation were perfect. This is the basis of the biotic replacement idea. The older communities were replaced not necessarily by one sudden enemy, but by a growing network of new interactions. Animals altered the ground. Animals consumed mats. Animals perhaps consumed one another and damaged soft forms. In doing so, they changed the rules under which large bodies succeeded. A world optimized for passive exchange, stable surfaces, and low disturbance gave way to a world where movement, internal digestion, defensive structures, and behavioral flexibility carried increasing value. Catastrophic extinction remains another possibility, though a more difficult one to fit cleanly. Late Ediacaran rocks do show major changes in ocean chemistry, including disturbances in carbon cycling and oxygen conditions. The oceans were not stable modern basins. They contained shifting redox states, meaning changing relationships between oxygenated and oxygen-poor waters. Such changes could have stressed organisms across wide regions. A fall in oxygen, a change in nutrient flow, a shift in seawater chemistry, or a broader environmental disruption might have harmed many Ediacaran organisms at once. The problem is that the fossil record does not show every group vanishing in one clean instant. Decline appears uneven. Some forms disappear earlier than others. Some late assemblages are still complex. Some environments may preserve older styles of life longer than others. This does not rule out environmental stress, but it weakens the image of a single sudden catastrophe as the whole explanation. The ending looks more like a drawn-out transition than a sharp collapse. It may include pulses of stress, but those pulses acted within ecosystems already being transformed by animals and sediment disturbance. The most persuasive picture is therefore not a single cause, but an overlap. Preservation windows close as mats decline. Ecological replacement intensifies as mobile animals spread. Environmental chemistry shifts in ways that affect oxygen, mineralization, and biological energy. Predation and skeletonization add new pressures. Each process alone explains only part of the pattern. Together, they describe a world in which the old Ediacaran strategies become harder to maintain. A rangemorph attached to a mat ground is vulnerable to the loss of that mat. A quilted organism, depending on contact with seawater, may be vulnerable to sediment change, competition, or burial style. A mat grazer such as Dickinsonia may persist only while microbial surfaces remain abundant enough to feed it. A tubular skeleton builder may benefit from a different chemistry and a different set of pressures. The transition selects not merely among organisms, but among ways of being alive. Fixed surface exchange becomes less dominant. Active feeding becomes more important. Soft impressions lose ground to traces, tubes, shells, and burrows. The fossil record changes because life changes, and life changes partly because the seafloor itself is being remade. This is why the end of the Ediacaran carries a quiet sadness without needing to be imagined as total erasure. Many of its most distinctive forms seem to leave no clear descendants. Rangemorphs, in particular, appear like a branch that flourished in the last chapter of the Precambrian and then stopped. They were not failures while they lived. They occupied deep seafloors, formed communities, developed varied architectures, and persisted across significant spans of time. Their failure, if that word is used at all, belongs only to the later view from a world they didn't enter. Evolution does not judge by resemblance to the future. It works within the conditions of the present. For millions of years, Ediacaran organisms solved the problems their world gave them. When the problems changed, some solutions no longer worked. This is one of the most important lessons of the period. The history of life is not only a march toward familiar animals, it is also a record of successful forms that were perfectly real, ecologically meaningful, and later left behind. The possibility of survival in altered form remains tempting, but it has to be treated with caution. Some later organisms have shapes that recall Ediacaran designs, fronds, discs, quilted surfaces, branching networks. soft bodies with radial or triradial patterns. Occasionally, modern deep-sea forms have been noticed because they seem to echo ancient geometries. Resemblance, however, is not inheritance. Simple shapes can evolve more than once when bodies face similar physical problems. A disc can anchor, a branch can increase surface area, a quilted structure can stiffen or divide tissue. Without clear anatomical, developmental, chemical, or genetic continuity, similarity alone cannot prove survival. The safer conclusion is that most of the classic Ediacaran body plans disappear as recognizable lineages by the early Cambrian, while some animal lineages that appeared during the Ediacaran continue forward in transformed ways. The Ediacaran does not vanish entirely from the future, because animals themselves carry part of its legacy. The first grazers, burrowers, bilateral bodies, and skeleton-building experiments belong to its closing chapters. What disappears is the older dominance of background communities and the more enigmatic large soft forms that once made the seafloor look so unlike anything later. This leaves the period in a position that is both foundational and unresolved. It is foundational because it records the rise of large multicellular life before the Cambrian, the first widespread experiments in body size, ecological spacing, animal movement, and behavioral organization. It is unresolved because many of its organisms still sit uneasily on the tree of life. Some can be drawn nearer to animals, some may fall outside known living groups. Some remain ambiguous because the fossils preserve too little of the anatomy that classification demands. Every new surface, new locality, and new method has the potential to shift the balance. Chemical fossils may clarify relationships. Three-dimensional preservation may reveal hidden structure. Better dating may separate environmental change from evolutionary sequence. More trace fossils may show how behavior spread before bodies became durable. The Ediacaran is not a solved preface to the Cambrian. It is its own interval, with its own lost architectures and its own incomplete testimony. At the end, the ancient mat grounds do not hand the planet smoothly to the Cambrian as if one age politely replaced another. They thin, break, and are worked over by new bodies. Soft fronds fade from the surfaces that once held them. Trails become more common. Tubes and skeletons begin to catch the light of preservation. The ocean continues, but its habits change. The Ediacaran biota remains behind as impressions, not only in stone, but in the shape of the question it leaves. Large life did not begin by looking inevitable. It began through alternatives, through bodies that made sense in vanished seas and then lost the world that had sustained them. Their disappearance is therefore not a blank ending. It is the point where one successful experiment in living gives way to another, and where the history of animals begins to rise from the disturbed surface of a disappearing sea floor. The Ediacaran closes without becoming simple. Its organisms remain in stone as impressions of a world that was real, widespread, and still partly unreachable. Some stood in dark water with bodies shaped by branching surfaces. Some rested on microbial mats and left only faint signs of contact. Some moved slowly enough for behavior to be preserved as a trail, a curve, or a shallow turning away from a path already used. The period does not answer every question it raises, and that is part of its lasting power. It shows a planet between old and new conditions, where microbial fabric still shaped the seafloor and animals were only beginning to disturb it. It shows that large life didn't arrive in one familiar form, already prepared for the future. It appeared through experiments in attachment, absorption, grazing, movement, pattern, and body architecture, many of which would not continue into later seas. Yet their disappearance does not make them lesser for their time. They were successful. They occupied space, formed communities, reproduced across ancient surfaces, and transformed the boundary between body and ocean into something visible at last. The Cambrian world that followed would become more active, more armoured, more restless, and more recognisable. But beneath that later brightness lies this softer chapter, preserved in ash, mats, discs, fronds, quilts, tubes, and trails. The Ediacaran remains a reminder that evolution is not only a story of ancestors leading neatly toward the present, it is also a story of lost ways of living, of conditions that open briefly and then close, and of forms that once made sense in seas that no longer exist. In those quiet impressions, Earth's ancient history keeps a memory of life before the modern animal world had fully taken hold, patient, strange, and nearly silent,